Walk through Biltmore today, and your guide will tell you about the 250 rooms, the $6 million construction cost, the European craftsman, the Vanderbilt vision, the architectural genius. What they won't tell you about are the workers who died building it. They won't mention the families displaced when George Vanderbilt bought 125,000 acres of North Carolina mountains. They won't discuss the opening day disasters that nearly humiliated the wealthiest family in America. They won't explain how close Biltmore came to being seized by the government after George's suspicious death at 51. The tour presents a fairy tale. Brilliant, scholarly George Vanderbilt creates a masterpiece in the wilderness. His devoted widow Edith heroically preserves it. Today, it stands as America's greatest architectural achievement, still family-owned, still magnificent. That story is true, but it's not the whole truth. Behind Biltmore's beauty is a darker history. Construction deaths rarely discussed. Labor disputes that threatened to shut down the estate. A hunting accident that nearly bankrupted the Vanderbilts through lawsuits. George's death under circumstances that sparked conspiracy theories. Edith's brutal legal war with the IRS that almost cost her everything. And today? The financial reality behind the family-owned mansion that nobody wants to acknowledge. Because Biltmore isn't really a home anymore. It's a carefully managed business empire that must generate millions annually just to survive. The fairy tale ending has a price tag most people never see. This isn't a story about how amazing Biltmore is. You already know it's amazing. This is about what it costs to build, what it costs to maintain, and what it costs today, in dollars, in lives, in compromises that transform a private palace into a public spectacle. Before we go inside the parts of Biltmore's history they don't put on the tour, and if you enjoy these investigations into the real stories behind America's grandest estates, please subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's start where Biltmore's story really begins, not with George's vision. With fire, death, and a tragedy that taught the Vanderbilts that wealth couldn't protect them from disaster. The accident that started everything. August 25th, 1892. Newport, Rhode Island, 3 a.m. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's mansion was burning. Not Biltmore. That didn't exist yet. This was the first mansion on that Newport property, the one that came before the breakers. A massive wood frame structure, filled with priceless art, surrounded by manicured lawns. The summer home of the wealthiest family in America. And it was on fire. The flames started in the basement, possibly from faulty wiring. Electricity was still new technology, dangerous, unpredictable. By the time servants noticed, the fire had spread through the lower floors. Smoke filled the servants' quarters first. They were sleeping. They didn't have a chance. Cornelius and his wife Alice escaped in their nightclothes, running into the Newport night. Their children got out. The family survived. But 3 servants died in that fire. Burned alive or suffocated by smoke while the Vanderbilts ran to safety. Their names are recorded but rarely mentioned. Mary Murphy, age 28. Catherine Connolly, age 35. Thomas Lynch, age 42. Irish immigrants working for one of America's richest families. They died because they slept in the servants' quarters, the cheapest construction in the house, the part that burned fastest. The Vanderbilt fortune, estimated at over $100 million, couldn't save them. All that wealth, all that power, and 3 people died because a mansion caught fire. The Newport community was shocked but not surprised. Gilded Age mansions were fire traps. Wood construction, gas lighting, fireplaces in every room, primitive electrical systems. The wealthy built bigger and more elaborate, but they didn't build safer. Fashion trumped function. Beauty trumped survival. Cornelius was devastated, not just by the deaths, though that haunted him, but by his own vulnerability. He'd thought his wealth made him invincible. The fire proved otherwise. He vowed to rebuild, but this time everything would be fireproof. Stone, steel, modern technology, nothing would burn again. He commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design the breakers, the massive Newport mansion that replaced the burned house. Hunt used steel framing, stone exterior, fireproof materials throughout. The breakers was a fortress disguised as a palace. But Cornelius wasn't the only Vanderbilt who learned from that fire. His younger brother George was there in Newport that summer. George watched his brother's mansion burn, watched the fire department arrive too late, watched Cornelius and Alice standing in the street in their night clothes, helpless despite their fortune. And George made a decision. When he built his house, the house he'd been dreaming about for years, it would be fireproof. Completely, totally fireproof. No wood frame, no gas lighting, everything modern, everything safe. He'd been planning a chateau in the North Carolina mountains. Now it would be a fireproof chateau. The Newport fire killed 3 people and destroyed 1 mansion, but it fundamentally changed what George would build at Biltmore. Every decision about materials, every choice about construction, influenced by watching his brother's house burn while servants died inside. Walk through Biltmore today, and you're walking through George's response to tragedy. The steel frame, the limestone exterior, the elaborate sprinkler systems, the multiple exits, the fireproof construction throughout. None of that was standard in 1895. George insisted on it because he'd seen what happened when you didn't. The irony is brutal. 3 Irish servants died so that Biltmore could be built safer. Their deaths taught the Vanderbilts that wealth couldn't protect against disaster, but it could buy protection for the future. Mary Murphy, Catherine Connolly, and Thomas Lynch didn't just die in a fire. They died so the next generation of Vanderbilt mansions would be fireproof. Their names aren't mentioned on Biltmore tours. There's no memorial, but they're part of Biltmore's foundation as surely as the Indiana limestone. The house exists in its current form because of what happened to them. One Vanderbilt learned from this tragedy: the land nobody wanted and the people George displaced. When George Vanderbilt looked at the North Carolina mountains in 1888, he saw wilderness, untouched nature, empty land waiting for his vision. He was wrong. The land wasn't empty. Over 1,000 families lived on what would become Biltmore Estate. Most were poor. Many were former slaves or their descendants, freed after the Civil War and given small plots to farm. Others were white families who'd been there for generations, scratching out livings from exhausted soil. Some were squatters, technically trespassing on land nobody else wanted. They'd built homes, raised children, buried their dead in small family cemeteries scattered through the mountains. They had churches, schools, communities. Not prosperous communities. The land had been logged out, farmed to death, abandoned by wealthier families who'd moved on. But these people had nowhere else to go. This was home. Then George Vanderbilt arrived with his checkbook. He bought the land piece by piece over several years. 125,000 acres. That's nearly 200 square miles. Entire communities purchased and cleared. George's agents negotiated with each family individually. They offered fair prices by the standards of the time, more than the land was worth agriculturally. But fair price doesn't mean fair choice when you're negotiating with a Vanderbilt. If you refused to sell, you discovered your neighbors had sold, and now you were surrounded by Vanderbilt property. Your access roads crossed his land. Your water sources were on his property. You could hold out technically, but practically you were trapped. Eventually, everyone sold. Some families relocated nearby, buying smaller plots with the money George paid them. Others left the region entirely, moving to cities, to other states, starting over. The small cemeteries were supposed to be protected. George's agents promised families they could still visit their ancestors' graves. But over time, as roads changed and forests regrew, many of those cemeteries were forgotten, lost somewhere in the 125,000 acres. George didn't see himself as displacing people. He saw himself as improving the land, and in some ways he was right. The land before George bought it was an environmental disaster. Decades of destructive logging had stripped the mountains. Soil erosion was severe. Streams ran brown with sediment. The clear-cutting had destroyed habitats, decimated wildlife, left the landscape scarred. George hired Gifford Pinchot, who'd studied forestry in Europe, to restore the forests. They replanted trees, controlled erosion, managed the land scientifically. This became one of America's first examples of sustainable forestry, proof that logged land could be restored. When George eventually sold 86,000 acres to the federal government, it became Pisgah National Forest, preserved forever. So George's version was true. He took devastated land and restored it. But the families who'd lived there had a different perspective. They took our homes. The contradiction is real. The land was environmentally destroyed. Yes, but people still lived there. They weren't destroying it. Previous generations of lumber companies had done that. These families were survivors, making do with what remained. George's restoration was environmentally positive, but socially disruptive. The workers George employed for construction came partly from these displaced families. If you couldn't live on your land anymore, you could at least work building the mansion that replaced your home. The wages were good by local standards. The work was steady. But there's a bitter irony in being paid to construct a palace on land where your family's cabin once stood. Today, Biltmore Estate talks proudly about George's conservation legacy, the forestry innovation, the land restoration, the creation of what became national forest. All true, all important. Environmental historians celebrate George Vanderbilt as a pioneer of sustainable land management. What they don't discuss much are the over 1,000 families who weren't there anymore by the time Biltmore opened in 1895. The communities that vanished, the small churches that closed because their congregations scattered, the schools that shut down because the children moved away. George bought the land legally, paid fairly by contemporary standards, didn't force anyone to sell at gunpoint. By Gilded Age standards, when many wealthy men simply took what they wanted, George was ethical. But ethical displacement is still displacement. Walk through Biltmore's forest today, those restored, beautiful forests, and you're walking through what used to be home to over 1,000 people. The land is healthier now than it was in 1888, but it's empty of the people who once lived there. George's vision required removing them first. The tour guides don't mention this. It's not a scandal. George didn't do anything illegal or even particularly unusual for his time. But it's a cost. One of many costs behind Biltmore's beauty. The land wasn't empty wilderness. It was cleared. But George wasn't building for them. The architect's impossible demand, Hunt versus Vanderbilt. When George Vanderbilt first approached Richard Morris Hunt about designing his North Carolina chateau, Hunt's response was immediate: no. Hunt was America's most prestigious architect. He'd designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. He'd created the elaborate cottages in Newport for the Astors and Vanderbilts. He'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so. If anyone could design what George wanted, it was Hunt. But Hunt was also practical. And what George was proposing was insane. The location was impossible. Middle of nowhere, hours from any major city. Transporting materials would be a nightmare. Finding skilled workers in rural North Carolina? Impossible. The climate was wrong. Hot, humid summers that would torture construction crews, winter weather that would halt work for months. And the scale George envisioned? A 250-room French chateau, bigger than anything in America, built in the wilderness. Hunt told George to build in Newport like a sensible person, or New York, somewhere with infrastructure, transportation, available labor. Building what George wanted in North Carolina would cost triple what it should cost, take twice as long, and probably fail. George didn't care about the cost. He offered Hunt whatever fee Hunt wanted, build it in North Carolina, or George would find another architect. Hunt agreed, but on conditions. 1. George would not interfere with the design. Hunt was the expert. George could state his requirements, size, style, features, but Hunt would determine how to achieve them. 2. George would commit to whatever budget Hunt determined was necessary. No cutting corners, no value engineering. If Hunt said a particular stone or technique was required, George would pay for it. 3. Hunt got final approval on all contractors and craftsmen. No hiring based on who was cheapest or most convenient. George agreed to everything. He wanted perfection, and Hunt was the only architect capable of delivering it. But the relationship was always tense. Two perfectionists collaborating on an impossible project, friction was inevitable. Hunt's genius was adapting French Renaissance architecture to American reality. The chateaux George loved in France's Loire Valley were built over decades by teams of craftsmen working in established traditions. America didn't have those traditions. Hunt had to invent American versions of European techniques. The limestone exterior came from Indiana. Millions of pounds of stone quarried and transported by rail. Hunt designed a temporary railway spur just to move materials to the site. Each stone was cut, numbered, and shipped. Italian stonemasons assembled them on site, creating a seamless facade that looks like it could be in France. But underneath that European exterior, Hunt used the latest American technology. Steel frame construction, revolutionary for residential buildings in the 1890s. This was skyscraper technology, adapted for a mansion. The steel frame made Biltmore fireproof and allowed for those enormous interior spaces. The banquet hall with its 70-foot ceiling, impossible without steel supports disguised as decorative woodwork. Hunt insisted on modern systems throughout. Central heating using a massive steam system, electric lighting powered by the estate's own generator, multiple elevators, luxury in 1895, hot and cold running water in 43 bathrooms, fire suppression systems, an intercom connecting different parts of the house, mechanical refrigeration in the kitchens. George wanted medieval romance. Hunt gave him medieval romance with modern comfort. The juxtaposition was deliberate. Live surrounded by old-world beauty without old-world discomfort. The design process took over a year. Hunt created detailed drawings for every room, every detail. George reviewed them obsessively, requesting changes, suggesting alternatives. Hunt would argue, explain why certain things had to be certain ways. Sometimes George won. Usually, Hunt won. The partnership worked because both men ultimately wanted the same thing: perfection. But Hunt was constantly frustrated by the location. Every problem took longer to solve because they were building in the middle of nowhere. Need specialized workers? Import them from Europe? Need particular materials? Ship them from around the world. Simple issues that would take days to resolve in New York took weeks in North Carolina. The costs mounted terrifyingly. Hunt had warned George it would be expensive, but even Hunt was shocked by how expensive. The temporary railway, the housing for workers, the time wasted waiting for materials, the premium prices charged by craftsmen willing to work in such a remote location. Every aspect of construction cost more than it should because of where they were building. Hunt died in 1895, just months before Biltmore was completed. He'd spent 6 years on the project, his final masterpiece. He never saw it finished. His son, Richard Howland Hunt, completed the final details, working from his father's plans. The relationship between George and Hunt created Biltmore, but it also nearly destroyed both men's sanity. Hunt's insistence on perfection, George's unlimited resources but equally unlimited demands. It was collaboration and conflict simultaneously. Hunt knew he was creating something extraordinary, something that would outlast both of them. But he also knew it was costing George a fortune that even a Vanderbilt would struggle to maintain. Hunt built Biltmore to last centuries. He just wasn't sure George could afford to keep it that long. The irony is that Hunt was right about everything. The location was impossible. The costs were astronomical. The construction took longer than it should. But the result? The result was worth every compromise, every argument, every impossible demand. Hunt created an architectural masterpiece. But masterpieces require masters, and masters are rarely easy to work with. The genius of Biltmore came from that tension. Hunt's practical expertise fighting against George's impractical dreams, with George's money ensuring that dreams won. But who would actually build this impossible dream? The workers who died building Paradise. The death toll from building Biltmore is officially unknown. No comprehensive records exist of construction fatalities. But based on similar projects of the era, on the 6 years of construction, on the dangerous nature of the work, historians estimate between 8 and 10 years, 15 workers died building George Vanderbilt's dream. Their names aren't recorded. No memorial marks their deaths. The Biltmore Company doesn't discuss them, but they existed. They fell from scaffolding, were crushed by stones, were caught in machinery, died from infections after injuries in an era before antibiotics. Building Biltmore was dangerous work, lifting limestone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds using pulleys and manual labor, working 70 feet in the air on wooden scaffolding, installing that banquet hall ceiling, digging the foundation by hand, no modern excavators, just pickaxes and shovels and dynamite to break through rock, operating primitive steam-powered equipment with minimal safety features. Construction began in 1889 with over 1,000 workers on site at peak times. The workforce came from everywhere: local men from the displaced families and surrounding communities, workers from Asheville, craftsmen imported from Europe, Italian stonemasons, French plasterers, English woodworkers, Spanish tile setters. They all converged on this remote mountain site to build something that shouldn't exist. George built an entire town for the workers. Brick Village, they called it, rows of modest brick houses where workers and their families lived during construction. Better housing than many had known, actually. George treated his workers well by Gilded Age standards. Decent pay, reasonable housing, medical care when they were injured. But decent treatment doesn't prevent accidents. And in 1890, workplace safety wasn't regulated. No OSHA, no safety inspections, no legal liability for employers when workers died. If you fell from scaffolding, that was your problem. Your family got nothing. You were replaced the next day. The Italian stonemasons had some of the most dangerous jobs. They worked with heavy blocks of limestone, cutting them to precise dimensions, hoisting them into place, carving decorative details while standing on scaffolding 70 feet above the ground. One slip, one moment of inattention, one rotten piece of scaffolding, and you fell. If you were lucky, you died instantly. If not, you died slowly from internal injuries while the estate doctor tried to save you with 1890 medical knowledge. The foundation work killed people. Digging through rock in the North Carolina heat, using dynamite to blast through resistant sections. Explosions went wrong. Men were buried in cave-ins. Heat stroke killed workers in summer. Hypothermia killed them in winter when work continued despite freezing temperatures because George was impatient. The steel frame construction, revolutionary and dangerous. Massive steel beams had to be lifted and positioned with precision. This was before modern cranes. Everything was done with pulleys, rope, human muscle, and hope. One beam slipping from its rigging could kill everyone below. The electrical work was particularly hazardous. Electricity was still new technology, poorly understood, inconsistently implemented. The generator that would power Biltmore was being built on site, an experimental system providing electricity to a house this size. Electrocutions happened. Fires started from faulty wiring and had to be extinguished before they destroyed months of work. George built a small hospital on the estate specifically to handle construction injuries. That tells you something about the injury rate. A wealthy man building a pleasure palace found it necessary to have a dedicated medical facility because so many workers were getting hurt. The hospital was staffed by a full-time doctor and nurses. It treated everything from minor cuts to fatal injuries. Most workers who died were buried locally. Some families took their bodies home, wherever home was. Others were buried in small cemeteries near the construction site. These graves still exist, scattered around what's now Biltmore Estate, unmarked and forgotten. No one tracks them. No tours visit them. The workers are as invisible in death as they were in life. The European craftsmen who came to work on Biltmore often stayed in America after construction ended. They'd been brought over for their specialized skills, and those skills were valuable. But some never left because they died during construction. An Italian stonemason killed in a fall was buried in North Carolina, thousands of miles from his family in Italy. He'd come for work and wages. He found a grave instead. The working conditions would be illegal today. 12-hour days, 6 days a week, no safety equipment, no harnesses for working at height, no hard hats, no safety glasses. You worked in whatever clothes you owned, with whatever tools were provided, and if you got hurt, you dealt with it or died. George wasn't particularly cruel by Gilded Age standards. Other wealthy men building grand estates had worse safety records. But the gap between George's comfort and his workers' danger was vast. George spent $6 million creating beauty. Some workers died creating it. Their families received nothing but their final wages and condolences. The craftsmen who survived left their marks on Biltmore: the carved limestone details, the elaborate plasterwork, the inlaid floors. This wasn't mass-produced construction. Every detail was handcrafted by someone who'd spent years learning their trade. Some of those craftsmen signed their work, tiny initials carved into obscure corners, marks of pride that tourists never notice. But the workers who died left marks too. The foundation dug by hand, the stone walls they positioned, the framework they erected. They're literally part of Biltmore's structure. The building stands on their labor and, in some cases, over their graves. Today, Biltmore employs around 2,000 people. They work in safety-regulated environments. They have health insurance. If someone dies on the job, there are investigations, lawsuits, compensation. The difference between then and now is stark. But walk through Biltmore and think about the workers who built it. Not just the famous architects and the wealthy owner. The nameless men who actually lifted the stones, carved the details, risked their lives to create someone else's vision. Some of them died doing it. Their names aren't in the history books, but their work still stands. The night everything went wrong. Opening day disasters. Christmas Eve, 1895. Biltmore House was finally ready. George had invited family and close friends to be the first guests in his completed chateau. Everything was prepared, everything was perfect, nothing could go wrong, everything went wrong. The heating system failed first. North Carolina winters aren't brutal, but late December can be cold, especially in the mountains. The massive steam heating system, state-of-the-art technology, Hunt's pride, developed leaks in multiple locations. Pipes burst, steam escaped. Entire wings of the house were freezing while the boiler room overheated dangerously. George's engineers worked frantically on Christmas Eve, trying to patch leaks, regulate pressure, keep the system functional. They succeeded partly. Some rooms were warm, others were freezing. Guests huddled near the few working fireplaces, wearing coats indoors, pretending everything was fine. Then the plumbing problem started. 43 bathrooms, all with hot and cold running water, except the water wasn't running, or it was running too much. Pipes had been improperly installed, or hadn't been tested under full pressure. Some bathrooms had no water. Others had water that wouldn't stop. One bathroom flooded, water seeping through to the room below, damaging plasterwork and requiring frantic cleanup. The electricity was intermittent. The generator worked mostly, but the wiring throughout the house wasn't properly connected. Lights would work in one room, but not the next. Some circuits were overloaded and kept shutting down. Others sparked alarmingly, creating fire risks in a house George had obsessively built to be fireproof. The elevators, multiple elevators, cutting-edge technology, were unreliable. One got stuck between floors with a guest inside. It took 30 minutes to manually crank it to the next floor and free them. After that, guests used the stairs, which defeated the purpose of having elevators. In the kitchens, chaos reigned. 3 kitchens designed to prepare elaborate meals for dozens of guests should have been more than adequate. But the new staff, many hired just weeks before, didn't know the systems. The mechanical refrigeration worked intermittently. The gas stoves had pressure issues. The new cooks were learning on the job while trying to prepare Christmas dinner for the Vanderbilts and their guests. The first dinner served at Biltmore was supposed to be a triumph. Multiple courses, each perfectly executed, served in that magnificent banquet hall. Instead, it was a disaster. Courses came late. Some dishes were cold. Others were overcooked. The wine was wrong. They'd brought up bottles from the cellar, but in the confusion, expensive vintages got mixed with cheap ones. Someone served a $50 bottle of Bordeaux with the fish course and house wine with the beef. George was mortified. He'd spent 6 years and $6 million creating perfection, and on the first night, with his family watching, everything was failing. His mother Maria was there, one of her last visits before her death the following year, and she was freezing in her bedroom, wrapped in blankets, wondering why her brilliant son's house didn't work. The servants were overwhelmed. They'd been hired rapidly to staff the enormous house, but they weren't properly trained. The 80-person household staff hadn't worked together before. They didn't know the house layout. Even with training, a 250-room house is confusing. They got lost trying to find rooms. They used the wrong staircases. They forgot which guest was in which bedroom. Edith Dresser, not yet George's wife, but visiting as a guest, watched the chaos and took charge. She'd been trained in running grand houses. She understood what needed to happen. Quietly, efficiently, she began organizing. She assigned servants to specific tasks. She helped redirect the kitchen staff. She calmed panicking workers. George was brilliant at vision but terrible at crisis management. Edith was brilliant at crisis management. The Christmas morning breakfast went better. Edith's intervention had helped, but problems continued throughout the holiday season. The heating remained unreliable. The plumbing had ongoing issues. The electricity would work for hours, then fail. Guests were gracious publicly. You don't insult your host, especially when he's a Vanderbilt. But privately they talked. Word spread through New York society. Biltmore was beautiful, but didn't work. George was devastated. He'd wanted Biltmore to be flawless. Instead, his first guests experienced a construction site disguised as a completed house. The gap between his vision and the reality of that first Christmas was humiliating. The problems weren't surprising to anyone who understood construction. You don't build the largest house in America using cutting-edge technology in a remote location and expect everything to work perfectly immediately. Systems need testing. Staff needs training. A house this complex requires months or years to fully shake down. But George had rushed. He'd promised Biltmore would be ready for Christmas 1895. His perfectionism had actually caused the problems. Insisting on completion by a specific date meant systems were installed but not thoroughly tested. It would have been smarter to delay the opening until spring, when everything could be properly debugged. But George's pride wouldn't allow delay. Over the following months, engineers fixed the heating system. Plumbers repaired the bathrooms. Electricians stabilized the power. The kitchen staff learned their roles. The servants figured out the house. By spring of 1896, Biltmore actually worked as designed. But that first Christmas remained a painful memory. George had imagined a perfect debut. Instead, he got a disaster that taught him humility. Even unlimited money couldn't force perfection on a schedule. Even genius architects and skilled workers couldn't anticipate every problem. The story of that opening night is rarely told. Biltmore's official history jumps from construction to successful operation, skipping the messy reality of things not working. But that messy reality is important. It humanizes George, showing that even he could fail. It demonstrates that Biltmore's eventual success came from learning, adaptation, perseverance, not from everything being perfect from day one. Once the house worked, the real challenges began, inside the servants' revolt of 1898. By 1898, Biltmore had been operational for 3 years. The systems worked. The staff was trained. George had settled into a rhythm of entertaining, managing the estate, pursuing his scholarly interests. Everything should have been smooth. Then the servants threatened to quit. All of them. Simultaneously. The problem had been building for months. Biltmore required 80 full-time servants at peak operation. That's a small army of people whose lives revolved around maintaining one family's comfort. And within that army, tensions had been growing. The pay was good by local standards. George paid better than other wealthy families, actually. But better than terrible is still not great. A housemaid at Biltmore in 1898 made about $15 per month plus room and board. That's roughly $500 today. Per month. For 12-hour days, 6 days a week, physically exhausting work. The upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the head chef, made more. Maybe $30 or $40 monthly. They also had significantly better living quarters and more autonomy. This created a rigid hierarchy where the lower servants lived in cramped rooms, worked the hardest, and had the least freedom while watching upper servants enjoy comparative luxury. The breaking point came over time off. Servants were supposed to get Sunday afternoons free, about 4 hours per week, but in practice that rarely happened. If guests were visiting, servants worked 7 days. If a big event was planned, days off were canceled. The promises made during hiring weren't being kept. A housemaid named Margaret, last name unrecorded, started organizing. She'd worked at other grand estates before Biltmore and had seen how servants were treated elsewhere. She knew servants had some leverage if they acted collectively. If one person quit, they were easily replaced. If all the servants threatened to quit, that was a crisis. Margaret quietly talked to other servants, the housemaids, the footmen, the kitchen staff, not the upper servants. They were too invested in the hierarchy. But the lower servants, the ones doing the brutal physical labor for minimal pay and no time off, they listened. The complaints were specific. Honor the time off promises. Improve the servants' quarters. Some rooms were barely heated. Increase pay for those doing the most dangerous work. Stop the practice of charging servants for replacing broken dishes or tools. If you were clumsy and broke something, the cost came out of your wages. In March 1898, Margaret and a group of about 20 servants requested a meeting with the head butler. He refused, telling them to get back to work. That's when they escalated. They sent a letter directly to George Vanderbilt outlining their grievances and stating that if changes weren't made, they'd resign collectively. George was shocked. He'd thought his servants were happy. He paid well. The housing was better than most servants experienced. He wasn't cruel or demanding. The idea that his staff was on the verge of mass resignation was incomprehensible. The head butler wanted to fire the ringleaders immediately. In most Gilded Age households, that's exactly what would have happened. You don't negotiate with servants. You fire the troublemakers and replace them. But George hesitated. Training new servants took months. Replacing 20 at once would be a catastrophe. And somewhere in George's scholarly mind, he recognized they had legitimate complaints. He asked Edith Dresser for advice. They weren't married yet. That would come later that year, but she was visiting and understood household management better than George did. Edith had grown up around servants, managed them in other houses. She understood the dynamics. Edith's advice: meet with them, listen, make reasonable changes. Not because George had to, but because it was smarter than fighting. Satisfied servants worked better. High turnover was expensive and disruptive, and some of their complaints were legitimate. The time-off policy was being violated. Some quarters were inadequately heated. George met with a small group of the servants, not Margaret, who'd been identified as the ringleader and would have been too confrontational, but representatives who could articulate the issues professionally. The meeting was awkward. George sitting in his library surrounded by priceless books, discussing working conditions with people who made his beds and cooked his meals. But he listened, and he made changes. Not all the changes they wanted. He wouldn't negotiate on wages, considering them already fair. But he committed to honoring the Sunday afternoon time off policy, except for genuine emergencies. He ordered improvements to the servants' quarters, including better heating. He eliminated the practice of charging servants for broken items unless negligence was proven. Most importantly, he didn't fire anyone. The head butler wanted retribution. George refused. You don't fire people for having legitimate grievances and presenting them respectfully. The threatened mass resignation never happened. Most servants stayed. Some left over the following months. They'd been unhappy before this, and the partial changes weren't enough. But the core staff remained, and morale improved. Margaret, the organizer, stayed for another 2 years before leaving to marry a local farmer. Her role in the near revolt wasn't officially recorded, but other servants knew. For years afterward, Biltmore servants remembered that you could push back against unfair treatment and survive. The incident taught George something important. Wealth didn't make people grateful. Good treatment was measured relatively, not absolutely. His servants might have better conditions than servants elsewhere, but that didn't mean they were satisfied. They compared their lives to each other and to what they'd been promised, not to hypothetical worse situations. It also showed the limits of George's vision. He'd thought carefully about architecture, art, forestry, but he'd barely considered the humans who'd make Biltmore function. He'd hired 80 people and assumed they'd be happy with decent pay and housing. He hadn't considered that they were people with their own ideas about fairness and dignity. Edith's role in resolving the crisis was crucial. George would have either fired everyone or been paralyzed by indecision. Edith saw the pragmatic solution: make reasonable changes, maintain authority, avoid catastrophe. It was a preview of her future role managing Biltmore after George's death. She understood people and power in ways George never would. The servants' revolt is another story Biltmore doesn't emphasize. It's uncomfortable. Reminds visitors that the Gilded Age involved real people in unequal relationships, not just beautiful architecture. But it's important history. Those 80 servants made. Retry, see, continue a Biltmore function. Without them, the house was just an empty shell. Their near revolt showed that even in the Gilded Age, even working for a Vanderbilt, workers could organize and demand better treatment. The hierarchy among servants continued. That wouldn't change. But the lower servants had proven they had power if they acted collectively. That knowledge changed the dynamic at Biltmore. Management became slightly less arbitrary. Complaints were taken more seriously. The threat of mass resignation remained unspoken but real. The upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, resented what had happened. They'd worked their way up through years of service, accepting harsh conditions to reach positions of relative comfort. Now lower servants were demanding changes the upper servants had never gotten. It felt like disrespect for the hierarchy they'd sacrificed to climb. But the lower servants saw it differently. Why should they accept terrible conditions just because previous generations had? The fact that servants had historically been treated poorly didn't justify continuing to treat them poorly. This tension between accepting hierarchy and demanding better defined labor relations at Biltmore for years. George's response to the crisis revealed his contradictions. He was genuinely progressive on some issues: forestry conservation, scientific agriculture, education. But he was fundamentally conservative on class issues. He believed in natural hierarchy, in some people being suited to command and others to serve. The servant uprising challenged that worldview. He accommodated it pragmatically, but never fully accepted it philosophically. The changes George made were minimal by modern standards. Better heating in servants' quarters, more reliable time off, not charging for broken items. These are things any reasonable employer provides. But in 1898, they represented concessions that George didn't have to make. The fact that he made them at all showed he was capable of learning. Edith's influence was growing. George relied on her judgment increasingly. She understood aspects of running a grand estate that George had ignored. The servants recognized this. They knew Edith had advocated for them. When she and George married later that year, the servants celebrated genuinely. They knew she'd continue advocating, balancing George's vision with operational reality. The near revolt also revealed something about Biltmore's finances that would become increasingly important. Labor costs were enormous. 80 servants at even minimal wages, plus housing, food, healthcare. It added up. Biltmore wasn't just expensive to build, it was expensive to operate, every year, forever. The costs never stopped. George could afford it in 1898. The Vanderbilt fortune seemed limitless. But his willingness to improve servants' quarters and conditions, while admirable, added to operational costs. Every improvement, every concession, every upgrade made Biltmore slightly more expensive to maintain. Those costs would eventually contribute to the financial pressures that nearly destroyed the estate. But servants weren't George's only problem. The hunting accident that nearly killed everything. October 1902, a hunting party on Biltmore Estate. 12 guests, all wealthy men from George's social circle. They'd spent 3 days hunting deer, bear, wild turkey on the estate's vast acreage. It was exactly the kind of traditional country house activity George wanted Biltmore to host. Masculine camaraderie, outdoor sport, evening dinners where the day's hunt was discussed over whiskey and cigars. Then someone shot the wrong target. The victim was James Patterson, not his real name, but the family paid to keep it quiet. Patterson was a New York banker, not particularly skilled at hunting, but wealthy enough to be included in George's social circle. He'd been separated from the group, tracking a deer he thought he'd wounded. Another hunter, maybe 50 yards away through thick forest, saw movement and fired. The bullet hit Patterson in the abdomen, not immediately fatal but serious. He screamed. The other hunters rushed to him. They were miles from the house, miles from the estate hospital, and Patterson was bleeding badly. They fashioned a stretcher from tree branches and coats, carried him back to Biltmore. Took hours. By the time they reached the estate hospital, Patterson was in shock from blood loss. The estate doctor, skilled for his era, but this was 1902, operated immediately. No antibiotics. Primitive anesthesia. The doctor did his best. Patterson survived the surgery but developed infection. He lingered for 6 days before dying in excruciating pain. George was devastated. A guest had died on his estate. Not from natural causes, but from a hunting accident that wouldn't have happened if George hadn't organized the party. The guilt was crushing. But the legal implications were worse. Patterson's family sued. Not for negligence. Hunting accidents happened. Everyone understood the risks. But they sued for wrongful death, arguing that Biltmore's hunting operations weren't properly supervised. They claimed George had allowed hunting without adequate safety protocols, without properly marked hunting areas, without sufficient guides to prevent hunters from accidentally shooting each other. The lawsuit sought $500,000 in damages, equivalent to about $15 million today. For George, even with Vanderbilt wealth, that was significant money. But the greater threat was the precedent. If George lost, it would establish that estate owners were liable for any accidents during recreational activities. Every wealthy person hosting guests for hunting, fishing, riding, they'd all be exposed to massive liability. George's lawyers fought aggressively. They argued that Patterson had assumed the risk by hunting. They presented witnesses claiming Patterson had separated from the group against instructions. They questioned whether Patterson's shooting was even an accident. Maybe he'd been mistaken for game by an incompetent hunter, but that wasn't George's fault. The Patterson family's lawyers countered that George had created the conditions for the accident by allowing hunting on such vast, unmarked acreage, by not requiring safety vests or other identification, by serving alcohol the night before hunts, by hosting more hunters than he had guides to supervise. The lawsuit dragged for 18 months. During that time, George stopped all hunting parties at Biltmore. The gun room, with its hundreds of rifles displayed like art, became a monument to activities that were now too legally dangerous. The guests who'd been invited for hunting found themselves attending sedate dinners and garden tours instead. Other wealthy estate owners watched the case nervously. If George Vanderbilt, with his resources and legal team, could be held liable for a hunting accident, what did that mean for them? Some stopped hosting hunting parties. Others required guests to sign waivers, though it was unclear if waivers would hold up legally. The case settled in early 1904. Terms weren't disclosed, but historians estimate George paid around $200,000 to the Patterson family. Not the full $500,000 they'd sought, but substantial. More importantly, the settlement included no admission of liability. George's lawyers ensured the settlement couldn't be used as precedent in future cases, but the damage was done. George had learned that hosting guests created massive liability exposure. Any accident, hunting, riding, swimming in that indoor pool, could result in lawsuits. His vision of Biltmore as a European-style country estate where guests enjoyed traditional aristocratic pursuits crashed against American legal reality. European aristocracy operated under different rules. A duke hosting a hunt where someone was shot wouldn't be sued. The injured party would accept it as unfortunate accident. But America had no aristocracy. George was just a wealthy private citizen, subject to the same laws as everyone else. He could build a chateau, but he couldn't import the legal immunity European nobility enjoyed. The hunting accident changed how Biltmore operated. Recreational activities were limited. Guests were supervised more closely. Waivers were required. even though their legal validity was questionable. Insurance was purchased, though insuring a property like Biltmore was expensive and complicated. The costs kept mounting. Building Biltmore, $6 million. Operating it annually, hundreds of thousands. Legal settlements, hundreds of thousands more. Insurance, tens of thousands annually. Every problem, every crisis, every accident added to the financial burden. George was wealthy enough to absorb these costs in the early 1900s. But the hunting accident revealed a deeper issue. Biltmore existed in a legal and social system that didn't accommodate what George was trying to create. He wanted a private paradise operating by aristocratic rules, but he lived in democratic America, where anyone could sue anyone, where wealth didn't grant legal immunity. The contradiction would haunt Biltmore for decades. You couldn't maintain a Gilded Age estate in 20th century America without constantly adapting to legal, social, and economic realities the estate's design never anticipated. George built Biltmore for an era that was already ending when construction began. James Patterson's grave is in New York, not North Carolina. His name isn't associated with Biltmore in any official history. But his death changed the estate fundamentally. It ended George's dream of Biltmore as a traditional country house, where aristocratic pursuits continued unchanged. It was one more cost, financial, legal, social, that George hadn't anticipated when he first envisioned his chateau in the mountains. George's death, the conspiracy theories. March 6, 1914. Washington, D.C. George Vanderbilt died on an operating table during what should have been routine surgery. He was 51 years old. The official cause, complications from an emergency appendectomy. The unofficial story is more complicated. George had traveled to Washington for business. Meetings about Biltmore's finances, which were becoming strained. He'd complained of abdominal pain for several days, but ignored it, pushing through meetings, maintaining his schedule. By March 5th, the pain was severe. Doctors diagnosed acute appendicitis. Surgery was necessary immediately. Appendectomy in 1914 was risky but not usually fatal. The procedure itself was well established. Thousands of people survived it. But George was in poor health generally. He'd always been frail, preferring books to exercise, never physically robust. Still, at 51, he should have survived. The surgery began on the morning of March 6th. The surgeon was experienced, the facility was adequate. But complications developed quickly. George's heart, always weak, struggled under anesthesia. His blood pressure dropped. He went into shock. The surgeon completed the procedure, but George never stabilized. He died that afternoon without regaining consciousness. The official explanation satisfied most people. Tragic, but these things happened. Medical complications. Unfortunate, but not suspicious. George was buried at the Vanderbilt family mausoleum in Staten Island. Edith was devastated. Their daughter Cornelia, only 13, had lost her father, but within weeks, whispers started. Questions that seemed reasonable if you were inclined to conspiracy theories, ridiculous if you weren't. Why had George traveled to Washington for business meetings when he was obviously ill? Why not postpone? Unless the meetings were urgent, so urgent he couldn't delay despite severe pain. What business could be that critical? The timing was suspicious. World War I would begin in Europe 4 months later. George had extensive European connections, years living there, investments, relationships with European nobility. Some conspiracy theorists suggested George was involved in pre-war financial maneuvering, positioning Vanderbilt money before war disrupted European markets. Others noted that Biltmore's finances were deteriorating. The estate was operating at a loss, consuming money faster than George's inheritance generated it. George had been considering selling land, reducing operations, making changes that would have been personally humiliating. What if the financial pressure was worse than anyone knew? What if George was facing bankruptcy? A convenient death would spare him that humiliation. The darkest theory, medical malpractice or even intentional harm. George was wealthy, powerful, connected. He might have had enemies. Someone in that operating room might have wanted him dead. An anesthesia mistake would be impossible to prove. The surgeon could claim complications, and who could challenge him? These theories were never proven. No evidence supported them beyond coincidental timing and suspicious circumstances. George probably died exactly how the official record states, complications from emergency surgery in a man with poor baseline health. Unlucky, not murderous. But the theories persisted because George's death was so consequential. His death triggered estate taxes that nearly destroyed Biltmore. His death left Edith fighting for survival. His death changed everything for the estate and the family. If someone had wanted to damage the Vanderbilts, killing George at that specific moment would have been devastatingly effective. The financial motive is most plausible. George's estate was valued at approximately $15 million, substantial but not enormous by Vanderbilt standards. His annual expenses approached $1 million. The math didn't work long term. Biltmore alone cost perhaps $500,000 annually to operate. George's income from investments was maybe $800,000. He was slowly going broke. If George had lived another 20 years, he might have had to sell Biltmore. The humiliation would have been crushing. The scholarly Vanderbilt, who'd built America's greatest house, forced to admit he couldn't afford to keep it. Death spared him that fate. Coincidence? Probably, but convenient. The medical records from George's surgery were lost or destroyed. Standard practice for the era. Medical records weren't carefully preserved in 1914. But the absence of records makes it impossible to verify or disprove the official story. We have newspaper reports, family statements, secondhand accounts, nothing definitive. Edith never publicly questioned the circumstances of George's death. If she had suspicions, she kept them private. She focused on survival, her own, Cornelia's, and Biltmore's. Investigating her husband's death would have been a distraction from the immediate crisis of estate taxes and operational costs. The conspiracy theories probably aren't true. George probably died from medical complications, bad luck, and poor health. But probably isn't certainly. The timing was suspicious. The consequences were enormous. And the lack of evidence makes it impossible to definitively settle the question. What we know for certain, George's death changed everything. He'd built Biltmore as a legacy. He barely got to enjoy it. He lived in the house only about 16 years after its completion. His daughter was 13 when he died. She grew up with a father who'd created this incredible place, then left her to deal with the consequences. George wanted Biltmore to last for generations. Instead, he died young, leaving Edith to fight battles he'd never anticipated. The dream he'd built became her burden, and that burden nearly crushed her. His death left more than just a widow and child. The IRS nearly took everything. Edith's legal war. When George died in 1914, federal estate taxes were modest. 1% on estates over $50,000, with a maximum rate of 10% on the largest estates. Edith's lawyers estimated she'd owe perhaps $150,000. Painful, but manageable. Then World War I happened. Federal spending exploded. The government needed revenue. Estate taxes were increased dramatically in 1916, increased again in 1917. By 1918, the top rate was 25%, and the IRS decided to reassess George's estate under the new rates. The assessment came in 1919. The IRS valued George's estate at $15 million and demanded immediate payment of $3.7 million in taxes. $3.7 million. Edith didn't have that much liquid capital. Most of George's wealth was tied up in Biltmore itself. The house, the land, the furnishings, the art. She'd have to sell massive portions of the estate to pay the tax bill. Edith refused. She hired the best tax lawyers in New York and prepared to fight. The battle would last 5 years and nearly destroy her. The IRS's position was straightforward. George's estate was worth $15 million. The tax was 25%. Pay $3.7 million or we seize property. They didn't care that Edith couldn't liquidate Biltmore easily. They didn't care that selling would destroy what George had built. Pay or lose everything. Edith's lawyers attacked the valuation. $15 million was absurd, they argued. Yes, Biltmore had cost $6 million to build, but construction costs don't equal market value. Who would buy a 250-room house in rural North Carolina? There was no market for such a property. It was essentially worthless as real estate because it couldn't be sold. The IRS countered that rarity creates value. Biltmore was unique, therefore priceless. If Edith wouldn't pay taxes on it, they'd seize it and auction it. Someone would buy America's largest house, even at a discount. The legal argument became philosophical. How do you value something that's one of a kind? Biltmore wasn't comparable to anything. There were no comps like in normal real estate valuation. Its worth was whatever someone would pay, and nobody knew what that was because nothing like it had ever been sold. Edith's lawyers brought in expert witnesses, real estate appraisers who testified that Biltmore's market value was maybe $3 million, less than construction cost because it was so specialized. Hotel operators who testified they couldn't convert Biltmore into a hotel profitably because the location was too remote. Potential buyers who testified they'd looked at purchasing Biltmore and decided it was impractical. The IRS brought their own experts who testified that Biltmore's art and furnishings alone were worth millions. That the land, 8,000 acres by this point, since George had already sold much of the original acreage, was valuable for development or agriculture. That Biltmore could be converted into a resort or school or institution. Someone would buy it. The case dragged through administrative hearings, then federal court. Each delay cost Edith money in legal fees. Meanwhile, she was trying to keep Biltmore operational, maintain the staff, manage the agricultural operations, raise teenage Cornelia. The stress was crushing. By 1922, Edith was desperate. The legal fees alone had cost hundreds of thousands. She'd already sold 86,000 acres to the federal government for $500,000 to raise cash. She'd reduced Biltmore's staff from 80 to about 50. She'd closed entire wings of the house to reduce heating costs. And still, the IRS wouldn't compromise. Then Edith made a calculated gamble. She announced publicly that if the IRS didn't settle reasonably, she'd donate Biltmore to the federal government as a national park. She'd take a tax deduction for the donation, zero out her tax liability, and let the government figure out what to do with a 250-room mansion. It was a bluff. She didn't want to give up Biltmore, but it was a credible bluff. The government didn't want Biltmore either. What would they do with it? Turn it into a museum? A government office building in rural North Carolina? The National Park Service had no interest in owning it, and if Edith donated it, the government would get zero tax revenue and be stuck with massive maintenance costs forever. The bluff worked. In 1923, the IRS settled. Final tax bill, $1.1 million. Still enormous, but less than a third of the original demand. Edith sold land, art, and furnishings to raise the cash. She borrowed against Biltmore's reduced value. She mortgaged parts of the estate. By 1925, the tax bill was paid, but the cost was more than money. The estate was smaller, down to 8,000 acres from the original 125,000. Much of George's art collection was gone, sold to pay taxes. Furnishings from lesser-used rooms were auctioned. The staff was permanently reduced. Entire sections of Biltmore were mothballed, furniture covered with sheets, rooms closed to save maintenance costs. Edith had won the legal war but lost much of what she'd been fighting to preserve. Biltmore survived but diminished. George's vision, a self-sufficient estate operating like European country houses, was dead. What remained was a smaller, less ambitious operation focused purely on survival. The IRS battle taught Edith brutal lessons. First, the government could destroy even the wealthiest families through taxation. The Vanderbilt fortune wasn't immune. Second, property that couldn't generate income was a liability, not an asset. Biltmore couldn't just be beautiful. It had to be profitable, or at least break even. Third, she was on her own. The extended Vanderbilt family offered sympathy, but no financial help. Each branch was protecting their own interests. Most importantly, Edith learned that Biltmore's future required radical change. The Gilded Age model, wealthy owner, private estate, no commercial activity, was dead. If Biltmore was going to survive, it needed to generate revenue. That realization would lead to the most controversial decision of Edith's life: opening Biltmore to paying tourists. But even before she made that decision, she'd already saved Biltmore once through 5 years of legal warfare against the federal government. She'd outmaneuvered the IRS, protected her daughter's inheritance, and kept George's dream alive. Damaged, diminished, but alive. The rules had changed forever. What Biltmore really costs today, the numbers they won't tell you. Stand at Biltmore's entrance today, buy your ticket, $75 to $95 depending on season, and you're participating in a carefully constructed financial operation that barely anyone understands. Because Biltmore isn't really a house anymore. It's a business empire that happens to contain a house. The Biltmore Company doesn't publish detailed financial statements. It's privately held by George Vanderbilt's descendants, so it doesn't have to disclose much. But through property tax records, industry analysis, and occasional financial leaks, we can estimate what it actually costs to keep Biltmore operating. Start with the basics. 8,000 acres in North Carolina. Property taxes on that much land, plus the house and its priceless contents, run approximately $5 million annually. That's just for the right to own it. Before you heat a single room or pay a single employee, the house itself requires a staff of hundreds. Not 80 servants like George employed. Those roles are divided differently now. But approximately 250 people work directly in house maintenance, preservation, and operations. Groundskeepers, electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, conservation specialists, security staff. Average pay with benefits, maybe $50,000 per person annually. That's $12.5 million just for core maintenance staff. Then tourism operations. Biltmore attracts over 1 million visitors yearly. Processing that many people requires hundreds more employees. Ticket sales, tour guides, retail workers, restaurant staff, hotel employees, winery workers. Easily another 500 employees at similar average compensation. 25 million more in labor costs. Utilities for a 250-room house, approximately $1 million annually. Heating, cooling, electricity, water. Modern climate control to preserve the art and furnishings costs more than George's original systems, because standards are higher. You can't let humidity fluctuate when you're protecting tapestries worth millions. Insurance, estimated at $3 to $5 million annually. You're insuring not just the building, but irreplaceable contents. Art, furniture, books. George's collection is worth hundreds of millions at minimum. The insurance alone could fund a small museum. Then ongoing preservation. A house this old, this large, constantly needs work. Roof repairs, stone restoration, woodwork preservation, plumbing and electrical upgrades, conservation of fabrics, paintings, books. Budget at least $5 million annually for maintenance projects. Some years are worse. Major restoration projects can cost tens of millions. Add security systems, groundskeeping equipment, vehicle fleet for estate operations, technology infrastructure, legal and accounting services, marketing and advertising. You're approaching 50 to 60 million in annual operational costs. Conservatively, now the revenue side. 1 million visitors at an average ticket price of $80. 80 million. Sounds profitable, right? Except that doesn't account for discounts, comps, group rates. Real revenue from admissions is closer to 65 million. The winery generates approximately 20 million annually. The Inn on Biltmore Estate, a luxury hotel on the grounds, maybe 15 million. Restaurants, retail shops, special events, another 20 million combined. Total revenue, approximately 120 million annually. So Biltmore makes money? Yes, but barely. After 60 million in costs, they're netting maybe 60 million profit. Sounds like a lot until you remember they need to constantly reinvest in preservation, expansion, and improvements. That $60 million profit is needed capital for keeping a 130-year-old house viable. And those numbers don't include estate planning costs. The current generation is working to transfer Biltmore to the next generation without triggering massive estate taxes. They're using conservation easements, charitable trusts, and complex legal structures to minimize tax liability. Those structures cost millions to establish and maintain. Here's what tourists don't understand. That $75 ticket isn't expensive. It's barely sufficient. If Biltmore charged what it actually costs per visitor to maintain the estate, tickets would be $200. They keep prices lower to maintain visitation. Empty seats on tours generate zero revenue. The wine. Rye isn't a luxury add-on. It's a critical revenue stream. Biltmore had to diversify income sources because admission alone couldn't sustain operations. Wine, hotel, restaurants, events. Each one was added because Biltmore needed money. Not wanted money, needed it. The family still owns Biltmore, yes. But ownership is complicated. They can't sell it. It's effectively unsellable at any price that would make sense. They can't dramatically change it. Historical preservation restrictions limit alterations. They can't stop maintaining it. Deferred maintenance would cause catastrophic damage. They're owners, but they're also prisoners. Biltmore owns them as much as they own it. The descendants of George Vanderbilt who manage Biltmore today are essentially running a business that happens to have family history. Some live on the estate, but in private quarters tourists never see. Their lives are constrained by Biltmore's needs. Vacations, career choices, personal decisions, all impacted by the responsibility of maintaining their ancestors' legacy. And succession planning is nightmare. Each generation must transfer ownership without triggering estate taxes that could force a sale. This requires lawyers, accountants, decades of planning. The current generation is preparing transfers that won't happen for 20 or 30 years. Planning for people who might not be born yet. Compare this to other Gilded Age estates, the breakers in Newport, given to Preservation Society because the family couldn't afford it, Vanderbilt mansions in New York, demolished because maintenance was impossible. Whitehall in Florida became a museum. Of all the grand Gilded Age estates, only Biltmore remains family-owned. Not because the family is richer, because they've worked harder, sacrificed more, and committed to a business model that most families wouldn't accept. Is it worth it? Ask the family members and you'd get complicated answers. Yes, because it's family legacy, George's vision, American history, but also, no, because it's constraining, expensive, exhausting. They can't just be rich people enjoying their wealth. They're managers of a historical property that happens to be their home. The fairy tale version of Biltmore, family lovingly maintaining their ancestral mansion, is true but incomplete. The reality is a sophisticated business operation generating over $100 million in annual revenue, employing over 1,000 people, operating multiple subsidiary businesses, all to maintain one house. George built Biltmore as a private retreat. Today, over 1 million strangers walk through it annually. He built it to last for generations. It has lasted, but transformed into something he'd barely recognize. He wanted a self-sufficient estate. It's now a tourist destination that survives by selling access to the dream he built for himself. That's the price of preservation. Not just the millions in annual costs, the transformation from private palace to public spectacle, from family home to business empire, from George's vision to managed historical property, Biltmore survived. But what survived isn't exactly what George built. It's an adaptation, an evolution, a compromise between preservation and practicality. The house stands, the family owns it. But ownership means something different now than it did when George opened those doors on Christmas Eve, 1895. The price of paradise. Walk through Biltmore today and you're walking through contradiction. The most beautiful house in America, built by workers who died creating it. The grandest private estate, maintained by opening doors to 1 million strangers yearly. The dream of one scholarly Vanderbilt, transformed into a business empire his widow built from desperation. George Vanderbilt wanted to create beauty that would last forever. He succeeded, but not how he imagined. The beauty remains. But the cost, past, present, future, is higher than he anticipated. The families displaced when he bought the land, the workers who died building his dream, the servants who almost revolted against their treatment, the hunting guest who died on his property, George himself, dead at 51 under circumstances that sparked conspiracy theories, Edith's brutal 5-year war with the IRS, the transformation from private palace to tourist destination. Every stone in Biltmore's walls was purchased at a price beyond money. Every room tourists photograph contains stories darker than the fairy tale version suggests. The success, the survival, required compromises that fundamentally changed what Biltmore is. Does that make it less remarkable? Number. If anything, knowing the true costs makes Biltmore more impressive. Because it survived despite everything. Despite the deaths, the financial crises, the legal battles, the transformations. It survived because people, from George to Edith to the descendants managing it today, chose to fight for it. But survival came at a cost. The displaced families never got their land back. The dead workers never got justice or acknowledgement. The servants who organized got modest improvements but remained servants. George barely enjoyed what he built before dying young. Edith spent decades fighting rather than living. The current generation manages rather than inhabits. The tour guides won't tell you most of this. They'll talk about the architecture, the art, the vision, and they should. Those things are real and important. But they're not the whole story. Behind the beauty is struggle. Behind the grandeur is cost. Behind the fairy tale is reality. Biltmore stands today as proof of what wealth can create, but also what it costs to maintain. It's American ambition and American excess. It's architectural triumph and human tragedy. It's one man's dream that required generations of sacrifice to preserve. George wanted Biltmore to be perfect. Instead, it's human. Flawed, complicated, costly, but still standing, still magnificent, still inspiring everyone who walks through those doors, even if they don't know the full price that was paid to keep them open. If this investigation into the hidden history of America's greatest mansion was valuable to you, please subscribe and like this video. These untold stories matter. Understanding what it really cost and costs to build and maintain beauty helps us appreciate both its value and its true price. Biltmore survived, but remember, it survived because people died, fought, sacrificed, and compromised. The palace in paradise required more than George Vanderbilt's millions. It required human cost we're still calculating today. $7 million. In 1895. That's what Cornelius Vanderbilt II spent building a summer house. Not a year-round residence, not his primary home. A place to spend 8 weeks escaping the heat of New York City. 70 rooms of Italian marble and gold leaf. 2 years of construction using the finest craftsmen in America. A palace designed to never burn, never crumble, never fade. And it worked. While every other Vanderbilt mansion in New York was demolished, while fortunes collapsed and families scattered, the Breakers still stands. Perfect, pristine, visited by nearly 500,000 people every year. This is the story of how one mansion outlasted everyone. The family who built it, the era that created it, every rival palace that tried to match it. This is about what happens when you build something not just for show, but to last forever. Before we begin, drop a comment below. Have you visited the Breakers? What fascinates you most about these Gilded Age palaces? And if you love these deep dives into American history, hit that like button and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's travel back to Newport, Rhode Island in the summer of 1895, when the greatest summer cottage in America first opened its doors. The $7 million summer cottage. Imagine spending more than $250 million in today's money on a vacation home. That's the Breakers. And the Vanderbilts didn't think twice about it. Newport, Rhode Island, in the 1890s, wasn't just a coastal town. It was where America's richest families came to escape the stifling summers of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. But escape is the wrong word. They came to compete, to display, to prove that their fortune was bigger, their taste more refined, their mansion more spectacular than everyone else's. The Vanderbilts already had a house in Newport, a wooden mansion they called the Breakers, named after the ocean waves that crashed on the rocks below. Nice enough, comfortable. But in 1892, it burned to the ground. Total loss. And Cornelius Vanderbilt II, standing in the ashes of his summer home, made a decision that would define Newport forever. He would rebuild. But this time, it would be fireproof. This time, it would be the greatest mansion Newport had ever seen. This time, the Vanderbilt name would be literally carved in stone. He hired Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who'd designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, who'd created palatial homes for the Astors and other Vanderbilts. Hunt was America's premier architect, the man you hired when money was no object and perfection was the only standard. Make it Italian Renaissance, Cornelius told him. Make it grand. Make it fireproof. And have it ready in 2 years. 2 years. Most palaces took 4, 5, 6 years to build. Cornelius wanted his in 2. He was 52 years old, running the largest railroad empire in America, and he didn't have time to wait. 2 years. That was the deadline. Hunt designed a palace inspired by the grand villas of 16th century Genoa and Turin. Not a copy, an adaptation. American scale combined with Italian elegance. The structure would be steel-framed, revolutionary for residential construction. The exterior would be Indiana limestone and brick, materials that couldn't burn. The interior would use marble, plaster, rare woods, but installed in ways that fire couldn't spread. 70 rooms. Not as many as Biltmore's 250, but each room in the Breakers was designed for maximum impact. Quality over quantity. Every detail perfect. The construction site became a small city. Over 2,000 workers at the peak. Stonemasons from Italy brought over specifically for the intricate carving. Plasterers who specialized in the elaborate moldings. Craftsmen who worked with gold leaf, rare marble, exotic woods. Materials shipped from across the world. Limestone from Indiana, marble from Italy and Africa, alabaster from Algeria. The main house covers 1 acre of floor space. 1 acre under one roof. The Great Hall alone rises 50 feet, a soaring space designed to make visitors feel small, insignificant, properly awed. Walls covered in rare Caen stone from France, a massive fireplace you could stand inside, and above, a ceiling painted to look like the sky with clouds drifting across it. Every room had a theme, a purpose, a message. The music room, covered in platinum leaf and rare French boiserie panels from a demolished Parisian mansion. Not gold. Platinum was rarer, more expensive, more impressive. The billiard room featured walls of Cipollino marble in shades of green and white. The morning room, where Alice Vanderbilt would receive guests, had walls covered in embossed leather. Original Renaissance paintings hung throughout, purchased from European collections. But here's what makes the Breakers particularly fascinating. It wasn't designed to be lived in year-round. Everything, every room, every detail, every spectacular space was created for 8 to 10 weeks of summer use. That's it. The rest of the year? The house sat empty, furniture covered in dust sheets, windows shuttered, a skeleton staff of maybe 10 people maintaining a 70-room palace that nobody occupied. The waste of it? The sheer extravagance was the point. Only the Vanderbilts could afford to build something this magnificent and barely use it. The bills mounted as construction progressed. Cornelius had estimated maybe 3 or 4 million. The final cost hit $7 million. In 1895 money, adjust for inflation, and you're talking about $250 million or more in today's dollars, for a summer house. His family thought he'd lost his mind. His siblings, who'd all inherited chunks of the Vanderbilt fortune, were building mansions too, certainly. But this was excessive even by Vanderbilt standards. $7 million for 8 weeks a year? Cornelius didn't care. This wasn't just about having a summer house. This was about legacy, about permanence. The family fortune came from railroads, dirty, industrial, nouveau riche money that old New York society looked down on. The Vanderbilts weren't considered real aristocracy. They were jumped-up traders who'd gotten lucky. The breakers would change that perception. This wasn't some gaudy display of new money. This was culture, taste, architecture worthy of European nobility. The Vanderbilt name carved in stone above the entrance, announcing their arrival in the highest ranks of American society. The construction raced forward. Hunt pushed the workers mercilessly. Cornelius visited constantly, checking progress, demanding perfection, changing details. His wife Alice worked with Hunt on the interior design, selecting fabrics, approving color schemes, positioning furniture. This would be her domain during the summer season, the place where she'd host the parties, the dinners, the events that would cement the Vanderbilts' social position. In the summer of 1895, the Breakers was complete. 2 years, as demanded. $7 million as reality dictated. 70 rooms of impossible luxury, ready for the Vanderbilt family. Cornelius stood in the great hall, looking up at that 50-foot ceiling, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd done it. He'd created something that would last forever. Something fireproof, destruction-proof, time-proof. The Breakers would stand as long as America stood. He was right about that, at least. But he had no idea how little time he'd have to enjoy what he'd built, or how quickly his own life would be destroyed by something no amount of money could prevent. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the brother who got the empire. Born in 1843, Cornelius Vanderbilt II didn't choose his destiny. It chose him. His grandfather, Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt, built a shipping and railroad empire through ruthless competition and brilliant strategy. When the Commodore died in 1877, he left the largest private fortune in America, about $100 million. In today's terms, that's more than many countries' GDP. But here's the thing about massive fortunes. Somebody has to manage them. And the Commodore didn't believe in splitting empires evenly among children. He believed in primogeniture. Give the bulk to one capable heir, let him maintain and grow it. So the vast majority went to Cornelius's father, William Henry Vanderbilt. William doubled the fortune in just 8 years, from 100 million to 200 million. But the stress killed him. He died in 1885 at 64, collapsing in his Fifth Avenue mansion after years of grueling work managing railroads, investments, and business battles. And the burden passed to Cornelius II, the eldest son. Not the fun Vanderbilt, not the one who married into European nobility or threw legendary parties or made scandalous headlines. Cornelius was the responsible one, the serious one, the one who understood that keeping a fortune required constant vigilance, brutal decisions, long hours, and enormous stress. His younger brothers got to enjoy the money. Willie K. Vanderbilt built Marble House in Newport and spent his time racing yachts. Frederick built mansions and collected art. They'd inherited millions, enough to live in spectacular luxury without working another day. Cornelius inherited the empire, the responsibility, the New York Central Railroad and dozens of other lines, thousands of employees, constant decisions about rates, routes, competition, strikes, regulations. It was a full-time job that consumed his life, and he took it seriously. While his brothers played, Cornelius worked. He was at his desk 6 days a week. He attended board meetings, reviewed financial reports, made strategic decisions that affected millions of dollars and thousands of lives. He was known as fair, but demanding. Not cruel like his grandfather, but not soft either. Business was business. He married Alice Claypool Gwynn in 1867 when he was just 24. Alice came from Cincinnati society, respectable, cultured, appropriate. They had 7 children who survived to adulthood. A proper Gilded Age family, living in a mansion on Fifth Avenue at 57th Street, maintaining the Vanderbilt name. But Cornelius felt the weight of expectations constantly. He wasn't just managing his own life. He was managing the family legacy. Every business decision, every social appearance, every dollar spent was scrutinized. The Vanderbilt name meant something, and it was his job to protect it, enhance it, ensure it remained synonymous with success. That's why the breakers mattered so much. It wasn't frivolous spending, it was strategic investment in the family's social position. Newport was where New York society summered. The Astors had their mansion, the Belmonts had theirs. The Vanderbilts needed to compete, to demonstrate that their fortune was as secure and their taste as refined as anyone's. So yes, $7 million for a summer house seemed excessive. But to Cornelius, it was necessary. This was business, just a different kind of business than railroad management. The problem was, Cornelius couldn't separate business from pleasure. Even at Newport, even during those precious 8 weeks of vacation, he worked. Telegraph wires connected the breakers to New York. Messengers delivered reports daily. He'd spend mornings in his study dealing with railroad business, then emerge for lunch, then return to work. Alice would host teas and dinners, while Cornelius worked through correspondence. His siblings noticed he was aging badly. At 50, he looked 60. His hair went white early. His face developed deep lines. He suffered from headaches, insomnia, digestive problems, all stress-related. Doctors told him to slow down, to delegate, to take real vacations. He couldn't, or wouldn't. The empire needed managing, and he was the only one who could do it properly. In September 1896, just over a year after the breakers was completed, Cornelius was at his desk in his Fifth Avenue mansion. Normal morning, stack of correspondence, business decisions to make. Then, without warning, the right side of his body went numb. He tried to stand and collapsed. Stroke. Massive. At 54 years old. He survived, but barely. The stroke left him partially paralyzed, his speech slurred, his mind clouded. He could understand what was happening around him, but couldn't fully engage, couldn't work, couldn't run the empire, couldn't do the job that had defined his entire adult life. Alice moved him to the breakers, thinking the sea air might help his recovery. For 2 years, Cornelius lingered in the palace he'd built, wheeled through those magnificent rooms in a chair, able to see but not enjoy, present but absent. The irony was crushing. He'd spent $7 million creating the ultimate summer retreat, and now he was trapped there, barely conscious, unable to appreciate any of it. The Great Hall with its 50-foot ceiling? He stared at it without comprehension. The Platinum Music Room? Meaningless. All those perfect details he'd obsessed over? Wasted on a man whose mind was slowly fading. In September 1899, 3 years after the stroke, Cornelius died. He was 56 years old. He'd owned the breakers for 4 years. 4 summers. Maybe 32 weeks total in the house that cost $7 million. Alice was 50 years old, suddenly widowed, suddenly responsible for a massive fortune and an even more massive house she'd never wanted in the first place. Cornelius had built the breakers for legacy, for the family, for permanence. Now Alice had to figure out what to do with it. The easy answer would have been to sell, cut her losses, take the money, move somewhere simpler. But the Vanderbilt name was carved above the entrance. This house represented something larger than one woman's comfort. It represented the family's position in society, their claim to permanence, their legacy. So Alice made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would keep the breakers, no matter what it cost, no matter how hard it became. She would maintain this palace, use it every summer, prove that the Vanderbilts belonged in Newport society. It was a decision that would test her for 40 years, because keeping a 70-room palace was expensive, brutally expensive. And the Vanderbilt fortune, solid as it seemed, wouldn't last forever. The night the first breakers burned, November 25th, 1892. Thanksgiving had just passed. Newport was nearly empty. The summer people had long since returned to their city mansions. The Vanderbilt's wooden cottage sat dark and quiet, with only a small caretaker staff inside. Around 6 a.m., someone smelled smoke. By the time they found the source, flames were already racing through the walls. Old wood, dry as kindling. The fire spread faster than anyone could react. Within minutes, entire sections of the house were engulfed. The caretakers fled, grabbing what they could, a few paintings, some silver, whatever was portable and valuable. Everything else burned. The local fire department responded, but what could they do? Their equipment was designed for small-town fires, not mansions. They sprayed water, but it was like trying to stop an avalanche with a garden hose. The flames roared, feeding on decades of accumulated wood, fabric, furnishings. By noon, the house was gone. Nothing left but the stone foundation, some chimneys, and piles of ash still smoking in the cold November air. Cornelius received the telegram in New York. His summer home, the place where his family had vacationed, where his children had grown up spending summers, where memories lived in every room, was gone. Total loss. The financial hit wasn't devastating. The house was insured, and Cornelius was rich enough that losing a summer cottage didn't threaten his fortune. But it was the violation that stung. Fire had invaded his property, destroyed something he owned, taken something from him. Cornelius Vanderbilt II wasn't a man who accepted loss gracefully. He traveled to Newport to survey the damage, walked through the ruins, ash crunching under his shoes. Looked at what remained. Not much. Charred beams, broken chimneys, the smell of smoke still hanging in the air weeks later. His children's toys, destroyed. Family photographs, gone. Years of accumulated possessions, reduced to nothing. Standing there in the ruins, Cornelius made his decision. He would rebuild. But the new breakers would be different. It would be fireproof. Absolutely. Completely fireproof. No wood construction. No vulnerable materials. He would build something that fire couldn't touch, that time couldn't destroy, that would stand for centuries. Money wasn't a concern. Time was the only constraint. The summer season started in late June. If construction began immediately, maybe, just maybe, they could have a new house ready in 2 years. Aggressive timeline. Probably impossible. But Cornelius didn't accept impossible. He summoned Richard Morris Hunt to Newport. Hunt was 65 years old, the most prestigious architect in America, semi-retired and working only on projects that interested him. The two men stood in the ashes together, and Cornelius laid out his vision. I want it Italian Renaissance. I want it grand, bigger than anything else in Newport. I want it fireproof, steel frame, stone exterior, materials that won't burn. And I want it done in 2 years. Hunt must have thought Cornelius was insane. 2 years to design and build a palace? With revolutionary fireproof construction? Using materials that would need to be quarried, shipped, and installed by craftsmen who didn't exist in America and would need to be imported from Europe? But Hunt was intrigued. This was a challenge worthy of his reputation. And the Vanderbilts paid well. Very well. He accepted the commission. The cause of the fire was never definitively determined. Faulty wiring maybe, a chimney issue, careless smoking. It didn't really matter. What mattered was the lesson. Wood burns. Tradition burns. The past burns. If you want something permanent, you need to build with materials that fire cannot consume. That fire in 1892 changed Newport's architectural landscape forever. Before the breakers burned, most Newport mansions were wooden. Elaborate Victorian cottages, certainly, but still fundamentally wooden structures. After Cornelius rebuilt in fireproof stone and steel, everyone else followed. Marble House, Rosecliff, the Elms. All the great Newport palaces that followed the breakers used fireproof construction. In a way, that fire was the best thing that could have happened to Cornelius's legacy. The old wooden breakers would have rotted, been demolished, forgotten. The new breakers, the fireproof palace, would outlast everything. But first, it had to be built, and that would require engineering and craftsmanship beyond anything American residential construction had attempted. Build it fireproof, build it fast. Richard Morris Hunt had a problem. Actually, he had several problems, all competing for attention. Problem 1, his client wanted a palace built in 2 years. Normal construction time for a house this size? 4 to 6 years minimum. Hunt had to compress that timeline by more than half. Problem 2, fireproof construction using steel framing was cutting-edge technology, proven in commercial buildings but rarely used in homes. Every detail would need to be engineered from scratch. Problem 3, the craftsmanship Cornelius demanded, Italian Renaissance details, elaborate stone carving, intricate plasterwork, required European artisans who would need to be recruited, transported to America, and managed on site. Problem 4, this wasn't just any house. This was the Vanderbilt statement to Newport society. It had to be perfect. No shortcuts, no compromises. Perfection on an impossible deadline. Hunt started with the structure. Steel framing would be the skeleton, a cage of metal beams that would support everything else. This wasn't common in 1893. Most houses, even mansions, used wood framing. But steel wouldn't burn. Steel was permanent. The frame was fabricated in sections, delivered by rail, and assembled on site like a massive puzzle. The exterior would be Indiana limestone over brick, 2 materials that couldn't burn, installed in layers for maximum fire resistance. But limestone isn't just slapped on a building. Each block had to be cut precisely, fitted perfectly, creating a weatherproof exterior that looked like it had been there for centuries. Hunt designed the house in the style of 16th century Italian palazzos, specifically inspired by villas in Genoa and Turin. Not a copy of any single building, but a synthesis, taking the best elements of Italian Renaissance architecture and adapting them to American scale and purpose. The result was unmistakably Italian in style, but uniquely American in ambition. The main house measures roughly 125,000 square feet, larger than a football field. 4 stories if you count the servants' floor and basement. The exterior features massive columns, elaborate cornices, and carved details that give the building visual weight and grandeur. This wasn't meant to blend in. This was meant to dominate. Hunt worked with a team of specialists. Engineers calculated load-bearing requirements for the steel frame. Stone specialists sourced limestone from Indiana quarries. Italian craftsmen were recruited to handle the decorative carving. Every detail had to be planned in advance because there was no time for mistakes. Construction began in early 1893. The site became a factory. Stonecutters working in temporary sheds, plasterers preparing molds, carpenters building forms for concrete. At peak construction, over 2,000 men worked on the breakers. Not just laborers. Skilled craftsmen, many brought from Europe specifically for this project. The Great Hall was Hunt's masterpiece within the masterpiece. 50 feet high, with walls of French Caen limestone, it was designed to awe visitors the moment they entered. A massive fireplace dominated one end, big enough to stand inside, carved with the Vanderbilt family crest. Above, a painted ceiling created the illusion of open sky. The effect was cathedral-like, spiritual almost, making visitors feel small and the house feel eternal. For the interior rooms, Hunt collaborated with specialists. The music room was created by French designer Jules Allard, who sourced original 18th century boiserie panels from a demolished Parisian mansion and incorporated them into the walls. The panels were carved gilded wood, exquisite craftsmanship from the 1700s, now incorporated into an 1890s American palace. But Hunt went further. The walls were also covered in platinum leaf, not gold. Platinum was rarer, more expensive, more impressive. The billiard room used Cipollino marble from Italy, green and white swirled stone that had been quarried since Roman times. Massive slabs were shipped across the Atlantic, cut to precise dimensions, installed by Italian stone specialists who'd learned their trade working on churches and palazzos. The ceiling was elaborate plasterwork covered in gold leaf. Even the light fixtures were custom designed. Throughout the house, Hunt faced the same challenge: how to make fireproof construction look elegant rather than industrial. Steel beams were encased in plaster or hidden behind marble. Heating ducts were concealed in walls. Electrical wiring, another cutting-edge technology, was run through metal conduits rather than exposed. The result was a house that looked traditional, but was technologically revolutionary. The timeline was brutal. Hunt pushed contractors mercilessly. Delays meant penalties. Mistakes meant rework on overtime. Materials had to arrive precisely when needed. Too early and they'd be damaged sitting in storage. Too late and construction would stop. It was logistical warfare, coordinating dozens of trades, hundreds of workers, shipments from 3 continents. Cornelius visited constantly, inspecting progress, demanding updates. He understood construction. He'd built railroad stations, bridges, industrial facilities. He knew what good work looked like and what corner cutting looked like. And he wouldn't tolerate shortcuts. This house would be perfect, or it wouldn't be. Alice worked with Hunt on interior design, selecting fabrics, approving color schemes, positioning furniture. She had refined taste and strong opinions. The breakers would be her domain during the summer season, her stage for entertaining Newport society. Every detail mattered. By summer 1895, impossibly, the house was complete. 2 years, exactly as demanded. The final cost had ballooned to $7 million, nearly double the initial estimate, but it was finished. 70 rooms of fireproof, earthquake-proof, time-proof magnificence. Hunt stood with Cornelius on the terrace, looking back at what they'd created. The architect was exhausted. The project had consumed 2 years of his life, pushed him harder than any previous work. But he was proud. This was his masterpiece. He'd solved impossible problems, met an impossible deadline, created something that would stand for centuries. Cornelius was satisfied. This was what Vanderbilt money could achieve. This was the legacy he'd leave. A palace that fire couldn't destroy, that time couldn't diminish, that would announce the Vanderbilt name for generations. Neither man knew that Hunt had just 3 years left to live, that Cornelius would suffer a stroke within a year, that all their planning for eternity would be tested almost immediately. But on that summer day in 1895, standing in front of the breakers for the first time, they'd accomplished something extraordinary. They'd built America's greatest fireproof palace. And unlike Linwood Hall, unlike so many other Gilded Age mansions, this one would survive. Everything. The rooms that made society gasp. Walk through the breakers' front entrance, and the first thing you see isn't a room, it's a statement. The Great Hall rises 50 feet above you. 50 feet. That's a 5-story building, for an entrance hall. Your eyes travel upward, past the French Caen limestone walls, past the carved details and massive columns, up to the painted ceiling designed to look like clouds drifting across an open sky. The effect is overwhelming. You feel small, insignificant, properly impressed. That was exactly the point. The fireplace alone could hold a dozen people standing inside it. Carved with the Vanderbilt acorn and oak leaf crest, symbols chosen by Cornelius's grandfather to represent strength and endurance. The mantel is so massive it required its own structural support, steel beams hidden in the walls just to hold it up. But the Great Hall was just the introduction. Every room beyond it was designed to surpass the last, creating a crescendo of luxury that left visitors stunned. Turn left from the Great Hall and you enter the music room. This is where Alice held her most important social events, where Newport society gathered for concerts and conversation. The room was created by French designer Jules Allard, and he didn't hold back. The walls are covered in platinum leaf. Not gold, platinum, rarer, more expensive, more Vanderbilt. But the real treasures are the boiserie panels. These aren't reproductions. They're original 18th century carved and gilded wood panels, salvaged from demolished French mansions. Artisans in the 1700s spent months creating these intricate designs, and now they're installed in an American summer cottage. The ceiling is coffered and painted with elaborate designs. The furniture, all original, is positioned precisely for both conversation and viewing performances. A Steinway grand piano, custom-made, sits in the corner. Not just any Steinway, one of their finest, selected specifically for this room's acoustics. Alice hosted musicales here, bringing in professional musicians from New York and Boston to perform for her guests. Tickets to these events were social currency in Newport. If you weren't invited to the Vanderbilt's music room, you simply didn't matter. Cross the Great Hall to the other side, and you reach the billiard room. This was the men's domain. Women weren't typically allowed in here during the Gilded Age. After dinner, the gentlemen would retire to smoke cigars, drink brandy, play billiards, and discuss business away from the ladies. Except Cornelius didn't allow smoking in his billiard room. Think about that. The room specifically designed for men to smoke and relax, and the owner banned smoking. Cornelius was paranoid about fire, understandably after watching his first house burn. So the billiard room became the world's most elaborate non-smoking lounge. The walls are covered in Cipollino marble from Italy, green and white swirled stone. The ceiling is gold leaf over elaborate plasterwork. The billiard table, massive, custom-made, perfectly level, sits in the center. But no cigarettes, no cigars, no pipes. His guests must have found this maddening. But it was Cornelius's house, and his rules applied. The morning room was Alice's private domain, smaller, more intimate than the public rooms. The walls are covered in embossed and painted leather, a traditional technique called cuir de Cordoue. The ceiling features elaborate plasterwork painted in soft colors. This is where Alice would meet with close friends for tea, where she'd handle correspondence, where she'd plan the week's social events. Light streams through tall windows overlooking the lawn and ocean beyond. Every piece of furniture was selected specifically for this room. Every painting positioned precisely. Alice had exquisite taste. Critics might say the Vanderbilts were nouveau riche, but nobody could criticize Alice's decorating. She studied European design, consulted with experts, created rooms that combined comfort with elegance. Up the grand staircase, and yes, there are multiple staircases because servants needed separate routes and couldn't be seen by guests, you reach the family bedrooms. These weren't public spaces, so they're somewhat simpler. Somewhat. We're still talking about rooms with marble fireplaces, elaborate moldings, ensuite bathrooms with fixtures imported from Europe. Cornelius and Alice had separate bedrooms, connected by a private sitting room. This was standard for wealthy couples of the era. Privacy was valued, and separate bedrooms meant you could wake and sleep on your own schedule without disturbing your spouse. Cornelius's room was relatively austere by breakers' standards. He wasn't interested in elaborate decoration. Alice's room was more ornate, with delicate furnishings and soft colors. The guest bedrooms were each unique, decorated in different styles to give recurring guests variety. One might be French Rococo, another Italian Renaissance, a third English country house. Alice wanted her guests to feel like they were staying in different European palaces without leaving Newport. But the most revolutionary spaces weren't the fancy rooms, they were the functional ones. The basement contained a swimming pool, 75 feet long, lined with elaborate tiles. This was 1895. Indoor pools were rare even in public buildings, almost unheard of in private homes. The water was heated, another luxury. There was also a squash court for exercise, storage rooms for luggage and sporting equipment, and extensive servants' quarters. The kitchen was massive, it had to be, to prepare meals for large dinner parties. Multiple ovens, enormous cooking ranges, preparation areas, separate rooms for different types of food storage. The refrigeration system was cutting-edge technology. Most homes still used iceboxes. The breakers had mechanical refrigeration. Servants' quarters occupied the entire fourth floor. Small but adequate rooms for housemaids, valets, cooks, and maintenance staff. There was a servants' dining room, sitting areas, even a small servants' hall for recreation. The Vanderbilts employed about 30 servants year-round to maintain the breakers, increasing to 40 or 50 during the summer season. Every room, from the grandest to the most utilitarian, was designed with the same attention to detail. The doorknobs were custom-designed bronze. The light switches, a new technology, were positioned for convenience. The heating system maintained comfortable temperatures throughout. Nothing was left to chance. When the Breakers opened for its first summer season in 1895, Newport society lined up for invitations. Everyone wanted to see what Cornelius had created. The house tours became legendary. Alice would personally guide important guests through selected rooms, explaining the art, the architecture, the European antecedents. It was education disguised as social display. Critics could call the Vanderbilt's nouveau riche all they wanted, but nobody could deny that the Breakers was a masterpiece. Hunt had created something that combined European sophistication with American scale and technology. Every room proved that Vanderbilt money, properly applied, could create beauty that rivaled anything the old world had produced. But beautiful rooms were meaningless without the right social context. And Newport in the 1890s wasn't just a resort town. It was a battlefield where America's wealthiest families fought for supremacy. The Breakers was Cornelius's weapon in that war. Newport's Gilded Age War. Understand something about Newport in the 1890s. It wasn't about enjoying the ocean breeze or escaping city heat. Those were excuses. Newport was about competition, social warfare conducted with mansions instead of weapons. The town sits on a small island off Rhode Island's coast. Beautiful location, mild summer climate, convenient by train from New York and Boston. In the early 1800s, it was a modest resort town where wealthy families rented simple cottages for the summer. Pleasant, quiet, unpretentious. Then the robber barons discovered it. By the 1880s, Newport had transformed into America's most exclusive summer colony. But colony is misleading. This was an oligarchy. Maybe 50 families controlled access. If you weren't accepted by the existing elite, you didn't matter. Your money meant nothing. Your business success meant nothing. Social acceptance was the only currency that counted. And the Vanderbilts, despite their enormous fortune, weren't automatically accepted. The problem was their grandfather, the Commodore. He'd been a ferryman who built a shipping empire through ruthless competition. He cursed like a sailor, had minimal education, didn't care about social niceties. He was rich, certainly, but not refined. Old New York families looked down on him as a jumped-up tradesman. His descendants were trying to overcome that stigma. William Henry Vanderbilt, Cornelius's father, had built culture. He collected art, donated to museums, behaved properly. His children were educated, mannered, appropriate. But the taint of new money lingered. The social arbiter of Newport was Caroline Astor, Mrs. William Astor, known simply as the Mrs. Astor. Her family fortune came from fur trading and New York real estate. Old money, she claimed, though it was really only a generation or two older than Vanderbilt money. But she'd established herself as the gatekeeper of New York and Newport society. If Mrs. Astor invited you to her events, you were in. If she ignored you, you were out. The Astors had their Newport mansion, Beechwood, and Mrs. Astor held court there every summer. The famous 400, the people who supposedly fit in her ballroom and represented the entirety of New York society worth knowing, spent their summers in Newport attending her parties, following her social rules. The Vanderbilts needed to prove they belonged, not just belonged, that they were superior. Richer, more cultured, more powerful. That's why Cornelius's brother, Willie K. Vanderbilt, built Marble House in 1892. It cost $11 million, pure white marble, designed to look like a Greek temple. Willie's wife, Alva, was even more socially ambitious than Mrs. Astor. She wanted to dethrone the Astor dynasty and establish the Vanderbilts as Newport's ruling family. When Marble House opened, it was the most expensive mansion in Newport, the most elaborate, the most impressive. Alva threw parties that made Mrs. Astor's events look provincial. She succeeded. Within a few years, the Vanderbilts had social status equal to the Astors. Then the Breakers opened in 1895. Cornelius hadn't built his palace to compete with his brother, or maybe he had unconsciously. Either way, the Breakers immediately became Newport's ultimate status symbol. Larger than Marble House, more technologically advanced, more historically authentic in its design, and backed by the main line of the Vanderbilt fortune, not a younger brother's inheritance. Other families scrambled to keep up. The Belmonts expanded their mansion. The Berwins built the Elms. Rosecliff was constructed for the Ulrichs family. Each mansion tried to outdo the others, bigger, grander, more expensive. The construction was competitive, conspicuous consumption, but it wasn't just about the buildings. The real competition happened inside them, at dinner parties, balls, afternoon teas. Who hosted the best events? Who wore the most expensive gowns? Whose guest list was most exclusive? Every social event was analyzed, compared, judged. Alice Vanderbilt played this game masterfully. She wasn't loud like her sister-in-law Alva. She was quiet, dignified, proper. She hosted smaller, more intimate events. Her dinner parties were known for exquisite food and sophisticated conversation. She cultivated artists, musicians, intellectuals, not just rich people. The Breakers became known as a place of culture, not just wealth. Her teas were legendary. She'd invite maybe 20 women to the morning room, serve tea in china worth more than most people's houses, and conduct conversation like a maestro conducting an orchestra. Everyone got to speak, but Alice controlled the topics, the tone, the flow. This was power, wielded with teacups instead of gavels. The summer season followed strict patterns. Families arrived in late June, stayed through August, departed after Labor Day. During those 10 weeks, there were balls, dinners, garden parties, yacht races, tennis tournaments, endless events requiring endless preparation, endless expense, endless social maneuvering. The servants worked brutal hours during the season, preparing mansion after mansion for events, serving dinner parties that lasted 5 hours, cleaning up after balls that ran until 3 a.m., then starting again the next day. For the wealthy, this was leisure. For the staff, it was exhausting labor. But here's what made Newport's competition particularly absurd. This was all for 10 weeks. These massive mansions, these armies of servants, these elaborate gardens, all for 2.5 months of use. The rest of the year the houses sat empty. The servants were dismissed or reduced to skeleton crews. The town became quiet, almost deserted. The Vanderbilts would lock up the Breakers in September, return to their Fifth Avenue mansion, and not think about Newport until the following June. 70 rooms sitting empty for 42 weeks. The waste was staggering, but that was the point. Only people rich enough to afford such waste belonged in Newport. This system couldn't last forever. Even in the 1890s, reformers were criticizing the excess. Newspapers published exposés about the cost of Newport mansions, while workers starved in city slums. Social critics condemned the inequality. But in the moment, Newport society believed its reign was permanent. They were wrong. World War I would begin the collapse. The Depression would accelerate it. Estate taxes and changing social values would finish it. Within 50 years, most Newport mansions would be abandoned, sold, converted to other uses. But in 1895, standing in the Breakers' Great Hall, looking up at that 50-foot ceiling, none of that decline was imaginable. This felt permanent, eternal, the natural order of things. Cornelius had won the war. The Breakers was Newport's crown jewel. The Vanderbilt name was secure. Now he just needed to enjoy it. 8 weeks a year. That's all he'd get. And even that would be cut short. 8 weeks of glory, 44 weeks of silence. The pattern repeated every year like clockwork. Late June. The Vanderbilt family would arrive from New York by private rail car. Trunks and trunks of luggage. Clothing for every occasion, personal items, books, everything needed for a 10-week stay. The servants would have arrived weeks earlier, opening the house, cleaning every surface, preparing gardens, stocking kitchens. By the time the family walked through the door, everything was perfect. Summer would explode into life. The great hall that had sat silent for 9 months would suddenly echo with voices, footsteps, activity. Dinner parties 3 times a week, afternoon teas, evening music halls. The house would fill with guests, family, friends, business associates, social connections. The 70 rooms would actually be used, their purpose fulfilled. Alice would orchestrate everything. Which guests in which bedrooms. Which china for which meals. which musicians for which concerts. The logistics of running the breakers during the season rivaled running a small hotel, 30 to 50 servants working around the clock, preparing meals, cleaning rooms, maintaining grounds, serving guests. The house became a perpetual motion machine of hospitality. Cornelius would try to relax, but couldn't fully escape work. Telegraph wires connected the breakers to New York. Messages arrived daily, board decisions, railroad issues, business requiring his attention. He'd spend mornings in his study, dealing with business, then emerge for lunch and afternoon social obligations. He was physically in Newport, but mentally still managing an empire. The children loved it. Summers at the breakers meant freedom, running on the lawns, swimming, playing tennis, enjoying the ocean. They'd invite friends from other Newport families. There would be impromptu parties, beach outings, sailing expeditions. For them, the breakers wasn't a showcase. It was home. For 8 weeks, the house fulfilled its purpose. Every room occupied. Every space used. The music room hosted concerts. The billiard room saw endless games. The morning room filled with afternoon visitors. The dining room served elaborate meals to dozens of guests. This was what $7 million bought. 8 weeks of perfect summer living. Then September would arrive. Labor Day marked the end. Families would depart Newport, returning to their city mansions, their real lives. The summer colony would empty like someone pulled a plug. Within days, Newport would transform from bustling social center to quiet coastal town. The Vanderbilts would pack up, trunks and trunks of belongings loaded into railway cars. The servants would begin closing the house, furniture covered in dust sheets, windows shuttered, valuable items packed away in storage, heating systems drained to prevent winter freezing, gardens prepared for winter dormancy. By mid-September, the breakers would be empty, silent, dark. A skeleton crew, maybe 10 people, would remain year-round. A caretaker couple, a few maintenance workers, minimal staff to prevent the house from deteriorating during the long months of non-use. They'd walk through rooms that had hosted hundreds of guests just weeks earlier, now empty and echoing. They'd check for leaks, maintain systems, ensure nothing broke or rotted. For 44 weeks, the breakers sat unused. 70 rooms, empty. The Great Hall, silent. The Platinum Music Room, dark. All those elaborate spaces, the billiard room, the morning room, the bedrooms, covered in sheets, waiting for next summer. Think about the economics of this. $7 million to build, thousands in annual maintenance, salaries for year-round staff, property taxes, utilities, all to use the house 8 weeks per year. That's roughly 15% utilization. You'd never run a business that way. But this wasn't business. This was status. And status doesn't answer to accounting. The waste extended beyond just the house. The formal gardens required year-round maintenance, pruning, planting, preparing for next season's displays. Somebody had to do that work, even when nobody was there to see the results. The lawns needed cutting. The paths needed clearing. The grounds of the breakers required constant attention, season after season, whether the family was in residence or not. Winter was particularly hard on the house. Newport winters aren't brutal by northern standards, but they're harsh, freezing temperatures, nor'easters bringing heavy rain and wind, salt air corroding everything. The house would hunker down, surviving, waiting for spring. The caretakers would fight constant battles. Leaks would develop. They always do. Pipes might freeze despite precautions. Windows would need repair. Small problems became larger if not addressed immediately. Maintaining an empty mansion was in some ways harder than maintaining an occupied one. At least with people living there, issues got noticed and fixed quickly. Come April or May, preparations would begin again. A crew of servants would arrive from New York or be hired locally. Rooms would be opened, aired out, cleaned. Dust sheets removed. Windows unshuttered. Furniture polished. The house would wake up, stretching after its long hibernation. By June, the breakers would be perfect again. Fresh flowers in every vase, beds made with crisp linens, kitchens stocked, gardens blooming, ready for the family's arrival and another 8 weeks of glory. This cycle defined the breakers for decades. 8 weeks of life, 44 weeks of waiting, over and over, year after year. A palace built for permanence, used part-time. But for Cornelius, even those 8 weeks were numbered. His health was deteriorating under the stress of managing the family business. The headaches were getting worse. The insomnia was chronic. His doctors warned him to slow down, to actually rest during Newport summers. He couldn't, or wouldn't. The empire demanded constant attention. In September 1896, just over a year after the breakers opened, Cornelius returned to New York from Newport. He'd had a good summer, relatively speaking. The house had been full of guests. Business had been manageable. He'd actually relaxed somewhat, though never completely. Back in the city, back at his desk, the stress returned immediately. Decisions piling up, problems requiring solutions, the weight of responsibility that never lifted. He worked through September into October. Normal schedule, normal stress. Everything seemed normal until the morning it wasn't. The man who died too soon. September 12th, 1896. A Tuesday morning. Cornelius Vanderbilt II is at his desk in his Fifth Avenue mansion, reviewing correspondence. He's 54 years old, middle-aged by modern standards, but in the 1890s, with the stress he's carried for years, his body is much older. He's reading a report, railroad finances, something routine. Then his vision blurs. The paper in his hand suddenly makes no sense. The letters swim and merge. He tries to stand, but his right leg won't respond. His right arm goes numb, heavy, useless. He calls for help, but the words come out slurred, incomprehensible. Stroke. Massive cerebrovascular event. In 1896, before modern medicine, before any real treatments, a stroke was a death sentence. Not immediate death, sometimes worse. The slow death of losing yourself piece by piece while your body continues living. Doctors are summoned. They examine him, confer, deliver the diagnosis that everyone already knows. Stroke. Severe. He might recover partially. More likely not. All they can do is make him comfortable. Cornelius understands what's happening. That's the cruelest part. His mind is trapped in a body that no longer fully responds. He can't speak clearly. Can't walk. Can't write. Can't work. Can't do any of the things that defined his life. The empire he'd run for decades. Someone else's problem now. Alice makes a decision. They'll move to the breakers. Out of season. The house is closed, but she'll open it. The sea air might help. Quiet might help. Getting away from New York's demands might help. It probably won't, but she has to try. So in October, with the summer season long over and Newport empty, the Vanderbilts return to the breakers. Not for vacation, not for social events, for medical care and hope. The house is opened, servants are recalled. Cornelius is installed in his bedroom with nurses attending him around the clock. Alice converts her routine entirely to caring for her husband. No social obligations now, no dinners or teas, just watching the man she's been married to for 30 years slowly fade. Cornelius has moments of lucidity, times when he can understand what's said to him, can communicate through gestures if not words. But those moments become rarer. The stroke has damaged too much. His body continues functioning, his heart beats, his lungs breathe, but the man himself is disappearing. He's wheeled through the house sometimes. Nurses push him through rooms he designed, past art he collected, through spaces he'd obsessed over. The great hall with its 50-foot ceiling, the music room with its platinum walls, all that magnificence, all that careful planning, all those millions spent, and now he can barely register it. The irony is crushing. He built the breakers to last forever, to be the family's statement to the world. He'd planned to enjoy it for decades. Summers with his children, then grandchildren, growing old surrounded by beauty. He got one summer. one single season to enjoy what he'd created before his body betrayed him. Months pass. His condition doesn't improve. The doctors are clear. This is permanent. He'll never work again. Never walk unaided. Never speak clearly. This is his life now, however long that lasts. And with stroke patients, predicting survival is impossible. He might last months, might last years. Alice maintains hope publicly, but privately she's preparing for widowhood, managing finances, making decisions about the children, handling responsibilities that had been Cornelius's domain. She has no choice. Someone has to run things, and her husband can't. The children visit when they can, but seeing their father this way is painful. The strong, capable man who'd built an empire, who'd commanded respect in boardrooms, who'd created this magnificent house, reduced to a silent presence in a wheelchair. They're losing him while he's still alive. 2 years pass, 2 years of Cornelius existing but not living, 2 years of Alice watching her husband's slow decline, 2 years of the Breakers serving as a hospital rather than a home. September 1899. 3 years after the stroke, 4 years after the Breakers opened. Cornelius's condition worsens. His heart, weakened by years of stress and now 3 years of immobility, is failing. The doctors can do nothing. This is 1899. They have no interventions, no treatments. They can only watch and wait. On September 12th, 1899, exactly 3 years to the day after his stroke, Cornelius Vanderbilt II dies. He's 56 years old. The funeral is held in New York at St. Bartholomew's Church. Society turns out in force. The Astors, other Vanderbilts, business associates, everyone who'd competed with or admired or envied Cornelius during his life. The newspapers cover it extensively. The death of a Vanderbilt is news. But the real story isn't the public mourning. It's what Alice faces now. She's 50 years old, a widow with children still at home, and she's inherited the Breakers. Not just the house, the responsibility of maintaining it, using it, justifying its existence. Cornelius had built it as a legacy, but he'd also been the one with unlimited income to support it. Alice has money, certainly. Widows of Vanderbilts don't starve. But maintaining the Breakers requires constant cash flow, servants' salaries, maintenance, taxes, utilities, repairs. The house consumes money the way it was designed to, constantly, extensively, without end. She could sell it. That would be the practical choice. Take the money, buy something smaller, live comfortably without the burden. Many widows would make that choice. But Alice refuses. The Breakers represents her husband's vision, his statement to the world. Selling it would feel like betrayal, like admitting that Cornelius's dream was impractical, that his legacy couldn't survive his death. So she makes a decision that will define the next 35 years of her life. She will keep the Breakers. She will maintain it. She will use it every summer, hosting the same social events, maintaining the same standards. She will prove that what Cornelius built can outlast him. It's a decision born of love and stubbornness in equal measure. A decision that will test her finances, her endurance, her determination. A decision that will ultimately save the Breakers from the fate that befell so many other Gilded Age mansions. But first, she has to survive. And survival, for a widow with a 70-room palace, was going to be harder than anyone imagined. Alice alone in 70 rooms. Summer 1900, the first season without Cornelius. Alice returns to the Breakers, and everything is the same. The servants have opened the house perfectly. The gardens are in bloom, the rooms are spotless, nothing has changed physically, but everything feels different. She walks through the great hall, that 50-foot ceiling that had impressed countless guests, and hears only silence. No Cornelius reviewing business correspondence in his study. No sound of his footsteps. The house feels empty even when servants are bustling around her, but Alice Vanderbilt isn't the type to collapse into grief. She's 50 years old, from solid Cincinnati stock, raised with Midwestern practicality beneath the social polish. Cornelius is gone. Life continues. The Breakers is her responsibility now, so she opens the house for the season. Smaller gatherings than in previous years, She's in mourning, and elaborate parties would be inappropriate. But she hosts teas, small dinners, intimate musicales. She maintains the social calendar, keeps the Vanderbilt name present in Newport society. This is what Cornelius would have wanted. The bills arrive regularly: servants' salaries, maintenance costs, garden expenses, utilities. Everything costs more than she'd realized when Cornelius was alive and handling finances. She has income. Cornelius left her well provided for. But maintaining the breakers consumes money at a staggering rate. She starts making small economies, nothing dramatic, nothing that would be noticed by guests or society. But she reduces the staff slightly, cuts back on expensive imported flowers, buys fewer new furnishings, small adjustments that save thousands of dollars annually. Her children are mixed blessings. The older ones are launched, married, living their own lives, but she still has younger children at home, requiring education, supervision, social debuts. And they all expect to summer at the Breakers. This is their childhood home, their connection to their father. She can't take that away from them. The years pass. 1900, 1905, 1910. Alice maintains the routine. Every June, open the house. Every summer, host events. Every September, close up and return to New York. The pattern Cornelius established continues because Alice refuses to let it stop. But Newport is changing. The absolute supremacy of the old families is eroding. New money keeps arriving. Families from the Midwest, from California, from industries that didn't even exist when the Vanderbilts first built in Newport. The social structure is loosening. The rigid rules are bending. Alice adapts. She's not rigid like Mrs. Astor had been. She welcomes new families if they have taste and manners. The Breakers remains important in Newport society, not because Alice demands deference, but because she's genuinely respected. Her decades of proper behavior, her dignified widowhood, her maintenance of standards, it all earns her a position that mere money couldn't buy. The costs keep rising. Everything gets more expensive. Servants demand higher wages. They have more options now, can work in factories or offices instead of domestic service. Maintenance on a 40-year-old house is constant. Roofs need work, systems need updating, things break. Property taxes increase as Newport becomes more developed. Alice starts making harder choices. She closes off parts of the house during the off-season. No point heating or maintaining rooms nobody uses for 44 weeks. She reduces the staff further. The dinner parties become smaller, less frequent. She's still maintaining the Breakers, but barely. Her friends notice. Other Newport families are facing the same pressures. The Gilded Age is ending. World War I proved that. The rigid social structure is collapsing. Several families have already sold their Newport mansions or converted them to other uses. The writing is on the wall. These massive summer cottages are unsustainable. But Alice refuses to sell. The Breakers is Cornelius's legacy. It's where her children grew up. It's the physical embodiment of the Vanderbilt family's position in American society. Selling it would be admitting defeat, admitting that what Cornelius built couldn't last even a generation. So she hangs on, summer after summer, year after year, watching her own energy diminish, watching her fortune, while still substantial, slowly drain into the house's endless maintenance needs. By the 1920s, she's in her 70s, still sharp, still capable, but tired. The Breakers demands constant attention. There's always something needing repair, some decision requiring her input. She's managing a 70-room palace essentially alone. Her children help financially, but they have their own lives, their own concerns. The younger generation doesn't understand her attachment to the Breakers. To them, it's just a house. An expensive, impractical house that consumes resources better spent elsewhere. They live in a different era. The 1920s are fast, modern, urban. Massive Newport cottages feel outdated, relics of a vanished world. But Alice persists. Every summer she opens the Breakers. Every summer she maintains standards. Every summer she proves that the Vanderbilts still matter in Newport. It's exhausting. It's expensive. It's probably foolish. But it's what she's committed to doing. She's 75 years old in 1929, still summering at the breakers, still maintaining the house, still fighting the slow battle against time and economics. She's held on for 30 years since Cornelius died. Surely she can hold on a bit longer. Then October 1929 arrives, the stock market crashes, and everything gets infinitely harder. The depression that should have killed it. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. The stock market collapses, taking American prosperity with it. Fortunes vanish overnight. Banks fail. Businesses close. The entire economic structure that supported Gilded Age excess comes crashing down. Newport empties faster than it ever has before. Families who'd summered there for generations suddenly can't afford it. The mansions close, not just for winter, but permanently. For sale signs appear on properties that had seemed eternal. The summer colony that had defined American high society is disintegrating. The breakers should have been one of the first casualties. Everything about it is obsolete in Depression-era America. 70 rooms? Absurd when people are homeless. Armies of servants? Impossible when nobody can afford staff. Massive maintenance costs? Unjustifiable when families are starving. Alice is 75 years old, managing this palace on reduced income. The Vanderbilt fortune hasn't vanished, they're still wealthy by any standard. But the cash flow has been severely damaged. Investments have lost value. Income from various holdings has dropped. The money that seemed infinite in 1895 is finite now, and decreasing. She faces impossible choices. Continue maintaining the breakers at pre-depression standards. That would drain resources needed for other family obligations, reduce maintenance to bare minimum. That would mean letting the house deteriorate, betraying Cornelius's vision. Sell? After 30 years of fighting to keep it, surrender now? She chooses the middle path, as she has for 3 decades. Severe cuts to expenses while maintaining the essential character of the house. The staff is reduced to absolute minimum, maybe 15 people, where once there were 50. Whole wings of the house are closed permanently. The gardens are simplified. No more elaborate seasonal displays, just basic maintenance. Social events essentially stop. Alice is too old, and the times are too harsh for parties. The music room that once hosted elaborate concerts sits silent. The billiard room sees no games. The dining room, designed for 50 guests, serves family meals for 3 or 4. The breakers becomes less a social center and more a refuge. Other Newport families give up entirely. Mansion after mansion closes or sells. Some are converted to schools, hotels, apartments, any use that might generate income. Others simply sit vacant, rotting, waiting for someone to decide their fate. The summer colony that had been America's most exclusive retreat becomes a ghost town. But Alice holds on, not out of pride now, out of stubbornness. She's 80 years old, she's been fighting for this house for 30 years, she's not stopping now. The depression will end eventually. The Vanderbilt fortune, while diminished, is still substantial. She can outlast this crisis. Her children worry. They see their mother, elderly and exhausted, clinging to a house that's consuming the family's resources. They suggest, gently, that maybe it's time to let go. Sell the breakers while it still has value. Use the money for more practical purposes. Cornelius has been dead for 30 years. Nobody would judge them for selling now. Alice refuses. Every suggestion is met with polite but firm rejection. The breakers stays in the family. End of discussion. The maintenance battles never stop. Every winter brings new damage. Every spring reveals new problems. Roofs leak. Repairs are expensive. Paint peels. Repainting the exterior would cost a fortune. Systems fail. The heating system, the plumbing, the electrical work, all aging, all requiring constant attention and money. Alice manages through force of will and careful financial management. She pays bills by priority, what absolutely must be done to prevent catastrophic damage versus what can wait. The house survives, but barely. It's no longer pristine. It's shabby around the edges, worn, showing its age, but it stands. The Depression grinds on. 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933. No end in sight. American capitalism seems to have failed completely. The whole structure that had supported families like the Vanderbilts, the industrial fortunes, the railroad empires, the assumption that wealth would perpetuate across generations, is collapsing. Yet the Breakers survives. Not thriving, not beautiful, but surviving. Alice's determination keeps it alive when economics says it should die. This 70-room palace that costs thousands monthly to maintain, that generates no income, that serves no practical purpose in Depression-era America. It endures because one elderly widow refuses to let it go. By 1934, Alice is 89 years old. She's outlived Cornelius by 35 years. She's maintained the Breakers through World War I, through the Roaring Twenties, through 5 years of depression. She's exhausted every avenue of economy. She's reduced staff to bare minimum. She's closed rooms. She's cut expenses to the bone. And still, every month, the bills arrive. Taxes, utilities, salaries for essential staff, minimum maintenance. The house consumes money simply by existing, and Alice is running out of ways to reduce costs further. Her health is failing now. Decades of stress, of fighting this endless battle, have taken their toll. She's bedridden much of the time. Her mind remains sharp, but her body is giving up. She knows she's near the end, and she knows the Breakers will face its greatest test when she's gone. Her daughters, Gladys and Gertrude, visit frequently. They see what's coming. When their mother dies, they'll inherit the Breakers, and they'll have to make the decision Alice refused to make for 35 years. Keep it or let it go. Alice dies on April 22nd, 1934. She's 89 years old. She held the Breakers for 35 years through impossible circumstances. She's the reason it still exists. But now she's gone, and the palace that killed her husband and consumed her life passes to the next generation. Gladys and Gertrude stand in the great hall, looking up at that 50-foot ceiling, and face the hardest choice of their lives. Their mother sacrificed everything to keep this house. But is their mother's sacrifice reason enough to continue the fight? Or is it time to finally admit what everyone else already knows? That the Breakers, magnificent as it is, cannot survive in the modern world. The answer they choose will determine not just the Breakers' fate, but establish a model for historic preservation that will save dozens of other endangered mansions. But first, they have to find the courage to do what their mother never could. Let go. The daughter's impossible choice. Spring 1934. Gladys Sechenyi and Gertrude Vanderbilt sit in the Breakers' morning room, surrounded by their mother's things, facing a problem that has no good solution. The house is theirs now. All 70 rooms. All the maintenance costs. All the responsibility. All the burden their mother carried for 35 years has just transferred to them. And they don't want it. This isn't their childhood home the way it was for their older siblings. They were young when their father died, spent less time at the Breakers, built their adult lives elsewhere. Gladys married a Hungarian count, lives in Europe much of the year. Gertrude has her own life, her own interests. Neither wants to spend the rest of her days managing a Newport palace. But selling seems impossible. Who would buy the Breakers in 1934? The Depression has decimated the market for luxury real estate. Nobody's buying 70-room mansions requiring armies of servants. Even wealthy families are downsizing, not expanding. The house might sit on the market for years, deteriorating while they pay maintenance costs and wait for a buyer who will never come. They could simply abandon it, walk away, let the bank or the state take it for unpaid taxes. Other Newport families have done exactly that. Better to lose the house than keep bleeding money maintaining it. But abandonment feels like betrayal of their mother's sacrifice, their father's vision, the Vanderbilt name. The newspapers would have a field day. Vanderbilt heirs abandon historic mansion. The scandal would be enormous. Then someone suggests an alternative. The Preservation Society of Newport County, a small organization dedicated to preserving historic buildings, might be interested in the Breakers, not to buy it, they can't afford to, but to operate it. Open it to tourists. Use admission fees to cover maintenance. Keep it preserved without the family having to manage everything. It's a radical idea. In 1934, house museums are rare. Opening your family's private mansion to paying tourists is something you do when you're desperate, when you've failed at every other option. It's admitting you can't maintain your own property. It's inviting strangers to walk through rooms where your parents lived and died. It's turning family history into a commodity. But what's the alternative? Continue what their mother did. Pour money endlessly into maintenance, sacrifice everything else to keep the house? They don't have their mother's stamina or her obsession, and they can see what everyone else sees. The Breakers is a relic. A beautiful, historic, important relic, but a relic nonetheless. It belongs to the past. The question is whether it can survive into the future. Gladys and Gertrude approached the Preservation Society with a proposal. The Society can lease the Breakers for $1 per year. They'll open it to public tours, charge admission, use the revenue for maintenance. The Vanderbilt family retains ownership, technically, but doesn't have to manage daily operations or pay maintenance costs. It's a compromise that saves face while solving the practical problem. The Preservation Society is interested but cautious. The Breakers is magnificent, certainly, but it's also a massive responsibility. Opening a 70-room mansion to tourists requires significant investment, insurance, security, guides, marketing, and there's no guarantee tourists will come. This is 1934. People are struggling to afford food. Who will pay to tour a rich family's summer house? But the Preservation Society recognizes this is a unique opportunity. The Breakers is Newport's crown jewel. If they can make this work, it could fund their entire organization. More importantly, it could save other endangered Newport mansions by proving that historic house museums can be financially sustainable. Negotiations take months. Lawyers draft agreements. Insurance companies calculate risks. The details are complicated. Who pays for what repairs? How revenue gets divided? What happens if tourism doesn't generate enough income? But both sides are motivated. The Vanderbilt heirs want to preserve the house without bankrupting themselves. The Preservation Society wants to establish itself as a major force in historic preservation. In 1948, 14 years after Alice's death, the final agreement is signed. The Preservation Society of Newport County will operate the Breakers as a house museum. The Vanderbilt family retains ownership of the upper floors. They can still live there during summers if they choose. But the ground floor, all the grand public rooms, will be open to tourists. It's not surrender. It's adaptation. It's recognizing that the Breakers can survive only if it serves a new purpose. It was built as a summer cottage for one family. Now it becomes a monument to the Gilded Age for everyone. The first tours begin tentatively. Admission is modest, $1 or $2. Guides lead small groups through the grand rooms, explaining the history, the architecture, the family stories. Visitors are curious, respectful, awed by the opulence. They walk through the Great Hall, stand in the music room with its platinum walls. Imagine what life was like when the Vanderbilts ruled Newport society. And they come. Not in huge numbers at first. This is still the late 1940s, still recovering from war and depression. But they come. Enough to justify the experiment. Enough to cover basic maintenance. Enough to prove the model works. The Vanderbilt daughters watch this transformation with mixed feelings. Pride that their parents' house is being preserved. Sadness that it's no longer truly theirs. Relief that they're no longer responsible for endless maintenance costs. It's complicated, as family legacies always are, but it's working. Other Newport families pay attention. If the Breakers can survive as a museum, maybe other mansions can too. Maybe there's a path forward that doesn't require abandonment or demolition. Maybe historic preservation isn't just about saving buildings. It's about creating new purposes for old spaces. The 1950s bring increased tourism. More people have cars, leisure time, interest in history. The Breakers becomes a destination. People plan vacations around visiting Newport mansions. What started as an experiment becomes a success story. By the 1960s, the Breakers is one of Newport's major attractions. Other mansions have followed its model. The Elms, Marble House, Rosecliff, all opening to tourists under Preservation Society management. Newport transforms from a dying summer colony into a living museum of the Gilded Age. The mansions that seemed doomed find new life serving a new purpose. The Vanderbilt family gradually withdraws from the Breakers. The upper floors, which they'd retained rights to, go unused. Maintaining even partial residence becomes impractical. In 1972, 77 years after the house opened, the family donates the Breakers entirely to the Preservation Society. No more private ownership. No more family connection. The house belongs to history now. It's the end of the Vanderbilt era at the Breakers, but it's also the beginning of the house's survival. Because what Gladys and Gertrude understood, what their mother couldn't accept, is that sometimes letting go is the only way to preserve what matters. Their father built the Breakers to last forever. Their mother fought to keep it in the family, but their generation saved it by giving it away. The Breakers today, a preservation miracle. Walk up to the Breakers today, and you're approaching a house that's 130 years old, built in 1895, survived everything the 20th century threw at it: 2 world wars, the Depression, the collapse of the social structure that created it, decades of changing American values that made Gilded Age excess seem embarrassing rather than impressive. And it's perfect. Not museum perfect with ropes and barriers making it feel sterile. Alive perfect. The limestone facade glows in the sunlight, clean and maintained. The windows aren't boarded. They're clear, letting light flood the interior. The grounds are immaculate, gardens blooming, lawns manicured. This doesn't look like a 130-year-old house. It looks timeless. Over 400,000 people visit the Breakers every year. That's more visitors annually than the Vanderbilt family hosted in the entire time they owned it. Every day during the summer season, hundreds of people walk through that entrance, gasp at the Great Hall, explore the rooms that once hosted Newport Society's most exclusive events. The tour guides know everything. They'll tell you about Cornelius building it fireproof after the first house burned, about Alice's 40-year struggle to maintain it, about the daughter's difficult decision to let the Preservation Society take over, about how this house, more than any other, proved that historic mansions could survive in modern America. The rooms are preserved exactly as they were. The platinum music room still shimmers. The billiard room's Cipollino marble still gleams. The Great Hall ceiling still makes visitors crane their necks in wonder. Nothing has been modernized or dumbed down. This is authentic Gilded Age excess, preserved for everyone to see and judge and understand. And people love it. They take thousands of photos. They imagine what it would be like to live here, to host parties in these rooms, to have 70 rooms and an army of servants. Some are impressed. Some are appalled by the inequality it represents. Most are just awed by the craftsmanship, the beauty, the sheer audacity of building something this magnificent for 8 weeks of annual use. The Preservation Society of Newport County has become one of America's most successful historic preservation organizations, largely because of the Breakers. The revenue from tours funds not just this mansion's maintenance, but preservation of other historic Newport properties. The model Gladys and Gertrude pioneered, family donation to preservation organization, operation as museum, has been replicated across America. But maintaining the Breakers remains expensive. Monumentally expensive. A new roof costs millions. Repairing the exterior stonework costs millions. Updating systems while preserving historic integrity costs millions. The admission fees help, but they're never enough. The Preservation Society fundraises constantly, solicits donations, manages endowments, all to keep the Breakers standing. Yet it works. Somehow, against all economic logic, this 70-room palace, built for one family's summer vacation, continues existing 130 years later. It's outlasted the family who built it, outlasted the social structure that supported it, outlasted the economic model that funded it, outlasted every prediction of its demise. Compare the breakers to Linwood Hall. Similar age, similar scale, similarly magnificent. But Linwood is a ruin. The breakers is pristine. Why? Because the breakers found a new purpose. Because the family let go. Because preservation won over pride. Or compare it to all the demolished Vanderbilt mansions, the Fifth Avenue palaces that were torn down for commercial development, the other Newport cottages that rotted and were demolished. The breakers survived not because it was better built or more beautiful, but because at the crucial moment, someone made the right choice. Someone recognized that saving the building mattered more than maintaining family ownership. Today, the breakers isn't just Newport's most visited mansion. It's a symbol of what's possible when preservation is done right, of how historic buildings can serve new purposes while maintaining their integrity, of why the past matters and deserves protection, even when it's uncomfortable or embarrassing. The irony is delicious. Cornelius built the breakers as a private palace, meant to exclude everyone except Newport's elite. Now it's a public museum, welcoming anyone who pays admission. The house designed to demonstrate Vanderbilt's superiority now demonstrates American ingenuity, our ability to preserve history, adapt traditions, make the past accessible to everyone. Walk through those 70 rooms today, and you're walking through more than just a house. You're walking through a miracle, a Gilded Age palace that should have been demolished decades ago but survived through determination, adaptation, and the recognition that some things are worth saving even when they're inconvenient. Richard Morris Hunt designed it to last forever. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. The breakers survives not because it's fireproof or structurally sound, though it's both. It survives because Americans decided it should, because we value history, because we recognize that understanding where we came from helps us figure out where we're going. Cornelius spent $7 million building the breakers and got 4 summers to enjoy it. Alice spent 35 years fighting to preserve it and nearly went bankrupt doing so. Gladys and Gertrude gave it away to save it. And now, 130 years later, nearly 500,000 people annually walk through the house they created, preserved, and saved. That's success. Not the success Cornelius envisioned. He wanted a family legacy, a private palace for generations of Vanderbilts. But a better success, a more democratic success, a success that says great architecture belongs to everyone, not just the wealthy. That history is shared heritage, not private property. The breakers stands today as proof that the past can survive, that beauty endures, that the right choices made at crucial moments can save treasures that seemed doomed. It's the Gilded Age palace that outlasted everyone, the robber barons who built Newport's mansions, the social structure that supported them, the economic model that funded them, the family that owned it. Through fire, death, depression, and change, the breakers survives. Not despite becoming a museum, because it became a museum. That's the survival secret. That's how you make something last forever in America. You share it with everyone. Picture yourself holding an invitation. Heavy cardstock, elegant script, and only one line. 350 Fifth Avenue. This isn't just a party invitation. This is a verdict on your entire existence in Gilded Age society. If it arrives, you matter. Your business deals close. Your daughters marry well. If it doesn't, you're nobody. Your fortune means nothing. Your mansion is just expensive real estate. One woman controlled who received that invitation for 50 years. Caroline Astor, known simply as the Mrs. Astor, didn't just host parties. She invented American aristocracy. In a nation built on rejecting inherited titles, she created something more powerful, a social hierarchy so rigid that European nobility looked on with envy. Her weapon? Architecture. While others spent fortunes on jewels, Caroline understood something profound. Control the physical spaces where society gathers, and you control society itself. Her ballrooms were sorting machines. Her mansions were fortresses designed to project power and intimidate rivals. The famous 400, the number who could fit in her ballroom, became shorthand for American exclusivity that persists 140 years later. That number wasn't arbitrary. It was architectural. It was calculated genius. But how did she do it? How did one woman, starting from a modest brownstone, build an empire that made industrial titans beg for invitations? How did she turn real estate into absolute social control? This is how Mrs. Astor's mansions gave her total control over the Gilded Age. Not through titles, not through office, through strategic real estate and theatrical genius that transformed American society forever. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into Gilded Age power and architecture, please hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps me continue researching and creating these videos. Also, please comment if you have any thoughts on the topic or if you have visited these mansions before. Now let's go inside. The brownstone that started an empire. In 1862, Caroline Schermerhorn married William Backhouse Astor Jr., connecting two of New York's oldest fortunes. The Schermerhorns were Dutch aristocracy, old Knickerbocker money that had been in Manhattan since it was New Amsterdam. The Astors were relatively new money, built on fur trading and ruthless real estate speculation by William's grandfather, Commodore John Jacob Astor. Old money, marrying new money. It should have been a perfect alliance, except nobody particularly cared. New York society in 1862 was chaotic. The Civil War was raging. Fortunes were being made and lost in months. The social structure that had governed New York for generations was collapsing as new industrial wealth flooded the city. Who belonged at the top? Nobody could agree. William's father, sensing an opportunity to elevate his family's standing, made a strategic decision. As a wedding gift, he gave the young couple prime Manhattan real estate, a plot on Fifth Avenue at 34th Street. The location was perfect, central, prestigious, but not yet fully developed. This was before Fifth Avenue became the address. William Sr. understood that his gift wasn't just land, it was position. The couple built their mansion in 1862. From the outside, it was deliberately understated. 4 stories, brownstone, respectable width at 50 feet by 107 feet deep. The only distinguishing features were Nova Scotia freestone accents around the windows and a double stoop entrance flanked by Corinthian columns. Classical. Dignified. Nothing that screamed new money desperation. This was Caroline's first lesson in architectural strategy. Restraint signals, confidence. Her Schermerhorn upbringing had taught her that true aristocracy never needs to shout. The Astors had fought for decades against whispers that they were vulgar, that grandfather's fur-trading fortune smelled of dead animals and sharp dealing. Caroline's brownstone whispered instead, "We've always belonged here." Inside, the house revealed more ambition. 3 connected drawing rooms on the parlor floor created a continuous entertaining space. Not massive by later standards, but clever. Guests could flow between rooms, creating the impression of greater space and grandeur than the footprint suggested. The formal dining room featured English Regency styling, another nod to European sophistication that new money Astors desperately craved. But the heart of the house was the ballroom. Not large, maybe 40 by 50 feet. Capacity, approximately 400 people if you packed them in efficiently. That number would become legendary, but in 1862, it was simply practical. 400 represented Manhattan's entire social elite. Every family that mattered could fit in Caroline's ballroom. The early years at 350 Fifth Avenue were quiet. Caroline was young, still learning her role. She hosted dinners, small receptions, the expected entertainments of a wealthy young matron. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing that suggested the empire she would build. Then 1869 arrived, and everything changed. Directly across Fifth Avenue, retail magnate Alexander Turney Stewart began construction on the largest private mansion New York had ever seen. Not a brownstone, not restrained. A pure white marble palazzo that looked like it had been airlifted from Renaissance Italy and dropped onto Fifth Avenue without apology. Stewart's mansion was obscene by old money standards, massive, elaborate, screaming new money with every marble column and gilded detail. It cost over $2 million, an unthinkable sum. When it was completed in 1869, it dominated the neighborhood like a commercial statement. I'm richer than you, and I want everyone to know it. Caroline, looking out her windows at Stewart's palazzo, understood something crucial. The game had changed. Restraint was no longer enough. If she wanted to maintain social supremacy, she needed to match and surpass the new money families that were building palaces across Manhattan. But she was patient. She watched. She learned. She hosted her annual January ball, carefully curating the guest list, slowly establishing herself as the arbiter of who belonged. The ballroom's capacity helped. 400 people meant 400 families, exclusive enough to matter, large enough to include everyone who needed to be included. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, 350 Fifth Avenue became the center of New York social life. Not because it was the grandest house, it wasn't. Not because Caroline threw the most lavish parties, others spent more, but because an invitation to Mrs. Astor's annual ball meant you existed in society, and the lack of an invitation meant you didn't. Ward McAllister, Caroline's social secretary and enforcer, helped codify the system. He called them the 400, the exact number who could fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The number stuck. Newspapers began referring to society as the 400. Families desperate for inclusion would ask McAllister what they needed to do, what they needed to change, how they could earn that invitation. McAllister would smile and explain, Mrs. Astor decides. And Mrs. Astor's decisions are final. The brownstone gave Caroline something more valuable than grandeur. It gave her scarcity. The ballroom's limited capacity meant exclusivity wasn't a choice. It was architectural necessity. She couldn't invite everyone, even if she wanted to. The house made exclusion inevitable, which made inclusion priceless. But by the early 1890s, the neighborhood was changing again. And this time, the threat came from within her own family. The neighbor war that changed everything. William Waldorf Astor was Caroline's nephew by marriage, her husband's nephew technically. He was also rich, ambitious, and deeply resentful that his aunt, not him, controlled the Astor family's social position. In 1890, William Waldorf made a decision that would change Manhattan real estate forever. He owned the property directly next to 350 Fifth Avenue, the plot where his father, John Jacob Astor III, had lived. When John died in 1890, William Waldorf inherited the house, and he immediately announced plans to demolish it, to build a hotel, not just any hotel, the Waldorf Hotel, a massive, luxurious establishment that would cater to wealthy travelers and host elaborate public functions. It would be grand, it would be profitable, and it would be right next door to Caroline Astor's brownstone. The message was clear. If you won't acknowledge my social position, Aunt Caroline, I'll build something that makes your precious exclusivity irrelevant. I'll open society to anyone who can afford a hotel room. Caroline was furious. A hotel next door would mean constant construction noise, traffic, commercial activity destroying the residential character of her address. Worse, it meant her nephew was essentially declaring war, trying to force her to acknowledge him as an equal by making her life miserable. William Waldorf played the situation perfectly. He was polite, regretful even, but business was business. The hotel would be built. Construction began in 1892. The noise was relentless. Hammering, drilling, shouting workmen, delivery wagons arriving at all hours. The construction shook Caroline's house. Plaster cracked. Windows rattled. Hosting elegant dinner parties became impossible when your guests had to shout over construction noise. For 2 years, Caroline endured it. She was 70 years old, had ruled New York society for decades, and now her own nephew was driving her from her home through sheer commercial spite. But Caroline Astor didn't surrender. She planned revenge. If William Waldorf wanted a hotel war, he'd get one. But Caroline would make sure she won. Not by building her own hotel. That would be beneath her. No, She'd build something that would make William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel look like a commercial afterthought. She'd build a palace. In 1893, Caroline made her move. She purchased property further up Fifth Avenue, at 65th Street, where the avenue faced Central Park. The location was perfect, further from the commercial creep-consuming lower Fifth Avenue. Facing the park meant permanent views, permanent prestige, and far enough from William Waldorf's hotel that she'd never have to acknowledge its existence. Then she made the most important decision of her architectural career. She hired Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was America's preeminent architect. He'd designed Biltmore for the Vanderbilts. He'd created the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. If you were Gilded Age wealthy and wanted a mansion that would announce your status for centuries, you hired Richard Morris Hunt. Caroline gave Hunt clear instructions: build me something that will make every other mansion in New York look provincial. Price is not a concern. Time is not a concern. Build me a palace worthy of America's social queen. Hunt smiled. He understood exactly what she wanted, not just a house, a statement, a fortress, a throne room from which Caroline could continue ruling society, but on a scale that would intimidate anyone who dared challenge her authority. Meanwhile, William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel opened in 1893 to great fanfare. It was magnificent, everything he'd promised. Elegant rooms, elaborate dining spaces, a social center for New York's elite. William Waldorf waited for Caroline to apologize, to admit defeat, to acknowledge that he'd won. She didn't acknowledge anything. She was too busy planning her new palace. William Waldorf's victory turned hollow quickly. Yes, his hotel was successful, but Caroline's departure had turned 34th Street into merely a commercial district. The address lost its social cachet the moment she left. The Waldorf was profitable, but it wasn't prestigious, not the way Caroline's residence had been. And then Caroline's son, John Jacob Astor IV, William Waldorf's cousin, made an unexpected move. In 1897, he built his own hotel directly next to the Waldorf, the Astoria Hotel, even grander than William Waldorf's establishment. The two buildings eventually merged, becoming the Waldorf Astoria, one of New York's legendary hotels. But by then, Caroline didn't care. She'd already moved, and her new address, 840 Fifth Avenue, would make everyone forget that 34th Street had ever mattered. The war was over. William Waldorf had won a battle by building a hotel. Caroline won the war by building an empire. Hiring Richard Morris Hunt, the architect of power. Richard Morris Hunt was 56 years old in 1893 when Caroline Astor walked into his office with an impossible request: design me a palace that will make every other mansion in New York obsolete. Hunt had heard ambitious requests before. He was America's first architect to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the man who designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, the architect behind the breakers in Newport and Biltmore in North Carolina. Every Gilded Age titan wanted Hunt because he understood something fundamental. These people weren't building homes. They were building statements. But Caroline's request was different. She wasn't trying to prove she belonged. She already ruled society. She wasn't competing with other wealthy families. She'd already beaten them. What Caroline needed was architectural intimidation on a scale that would prevent future challenges entirely. Hunt understood immediately. This wasn't about beauty or comfort or even grandeur. This was about power made physical. He proposed a radical idea: spend 3 months in Europe studying the great chateaux of France. Not to copy them. Americans had been doing that badly for decades. But to understand the psychology behind them. How did French aristocracy use architecture to project permanence? What made visitors feel small before they even met the nobles inside? Caroline agreed without hesitation. Money was no object. Time was no object. Get it right. Hunt departed for France in late 1893, sketchbook in hand. He studied the chateaux of the Loire Valley, Chambord, Chenonceau, Blois. These weren't just large houses. They were designed to overwhelm, to announce that the families living inside had been powerful for centuries, and would remain powerful for centuries more. He paid particular attention to proportion. A chateau's power came not from size alone, but from the relationship between scale and detail. Massive walls covered in intricate stone carving, soaring roof lines that drew the eye upward, making visitors crane their necks, grand staircases that forced guests to ascend dramatically, arriving at the main floor already feeling diminished by the journey. Hunt filled notebooks with measurements, sketches, observations about sight lines and material choices. He studied how light fell through tall windows, how marble reflected and amplified grandeur, how the progression through rooms could be choreographed to build anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. When he returned to New York in early 1894, Hunt brought Caroline something more valuable than drawings. He brought psychological architecture. The design he presented wasn't a copy of any single French chateau. It was a synthesis, the best elements of French Renaissance architecture adapted for American ambitions and Manhattan's rectangular lots. The style would be early 16th century French Renaissance, reminiscent of the Chateau de Blois, but larger, more elaborate, more intimidating. Hunt explained his vision. The mansion would read as two separate residences joined by a magnificent glass-domed entrance hall. From the street, it would appear as one unified palace. Inside, careful planning would separate Caroline's domain from her son John Jacob Astor IV's residence, while shared spaces, particularly the ballroom, would demonstrate family unity and dynastic ambition. The entrance sequence was crucial. Visitors would pass through bronze gates, cross a forecourt, enter through massive doors into a vestibule lined with marble busts of Astor ancestors. Hunt understood the psychological power of making guests walk past previous generations before meeting the current matriarch. It announced, "This family has history, permanence, continuity. You are temporary. We are eternal." From the vestibule, guests would enter the great hall, 3 stories of marble magnificence with a cantilevered staircase rising dramatically upward. Hunt designed this space to make visitors feel physically small. The ceiling soared 50 feet above. The stairs were wide enough for 10 people to ascend side by side, but most guests would climb alone, acutely aware of their insignificance in this vast stone theater. Every material choice reinforced the message. Indiana limestone for the exterior, it would last centuries, weathering to a dignified patina that suggested age even when new. French-con stone for interior walls, the same material used in medieval cathedrals. Black marble for the dining room because nothing says permanence like stone so heavy it requires reinforced floors. Hunt also understood modern comfort hidden behind historical aesthetics. The mansion would have central heating, massive coal-fired boilers in the basement sending steam through miles of pipes. Electric lighting throughout, powered by the building's own generator. Elevators for staff and family. Modern plumbing with hot and cold running water in every bathroom. This juxtaposition was intentional. The house would look like a 16th century French chateau, but function with 1890s American technology. Guests would experience the intimidation of old-world aristocracy without any of the discomfort. It was theatrical illusion backed by modern engineering. Hunt's fee was substantial, tens of thousands of dollars just for the design work. But Caroline understood she wasn't paying for architectural drawings. She was paying for Hunt's understanding of power, his ability to translate social dominance into physical form. Construction began in 1894 on 2 adjacent lots at 5th Avenue and 65th Street. The site measured 100 feet by 100 feet, substantial but not enormous by Gilded Age standards. Hunt's genius was making the space feel vast through proportion and detail rather than raw square footage. He hired the finest craftsmen available, stonemasons from Italy who'd learned their trade working on cathedrals, French artisans who specialized in the intricate plasterwork that would cover ceilings throughout the mansion. The same workshops that had created interiors for European nobility now worked for Mrs. Astor. Hunt visited the construction site daily, checking every detail personally. When limestone blocks arrived from Indiana quarries, he inspected each one for color consistency. When Italian craftsmen installed marble floors, He verified the patterns matched his drawings exactly. This level of obsessive attention cost money and time, but Hunt knew Caroline would accept nothing less than perfection. Jules Allard, the legendary interior designer, worked alongside Hunt, creating the French-style interiors. Allard had decorated countless European palaces and understood the language of aristocratic taste. Wood paneling hand-carved in France and shipped to New York. Silk wall coverings woven to Hunt's specifications. Furniture that looked antique but was actually new, built to accommodate modern bodies while suggesting centuries of family ownership. The project took 2 years. By 1896, the mansion was complete. Hunt had created exactly what Caroline requested, a palace that made every other New York residence look provincial by comparison. But Hunt's greatest achievement wasn't the building itself. It was understanding that architecture could be weaponized, that a well-designed entrance sequence could intimidate as effectively as words, that material choices could project permanence and power, that the physical spaces where society gathered determined who controlled society itself. Richard Morris Hunt died in 1895, just before the mansion's completion. He never saw Caroline preside over her first ball in the new space. But his design would serve her purposes perfectly for the next 12 years, until her death in 1908. Hunt had built more than a mansion. He'd built a machine designed for one purpose: maintaining Caroline Astor's absolute control over American society. The double mansion strategy. The mansion that rose at 840 to 842 Fifth Avenue wasn't one house. It was two. And that distinction was everything. From the street, visitors saw a unified French chateau, symmetrical, elegant, impossibly grand. 4 stories of Indiana limestone rising from the corner of Fifth Avenue and 65th Street, facing Central Park with aristocratic confidence. The facade suggested one massive palace belonging to one powerful family. But behind that unified exterior lay careful separation. The building's design created 2 distinct residences divided by a central partition wall, each with its own entrance, its own service areas, its own private spaces. Caroline occupied the northern half at 840 Fifth Avenue. Her son John Jacob Astor IV occupied the southern portion at 842 Fifth Avenue. This wasn't about saving money by building together. Both had fortunes sufficient to build separate palaces. This was strategy. And Caroline's strategic genius was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. First, the appearance of unity. A divided mansion still looked like one palace from outside. The message to society was clear. The Astors were a dynasty, not individuals. When you dealt with Caroline, you were dealing with the family's full power. When you offended Caroline, you offended John Jacob IV and his considerable business influence. The architecture announced that challenging Mrs. Astor meant challenging an entire clan. Second, actual independence. Behind the unified facade, Caroline maintained complete control over her domain, her entrance, her servants, her decisions about decoration, entertaining, daily life. She wasn't living in her son's house or sharing control with a younger generation. The partition wall gave her autonomy while projecting familial solidarity. Third, the shared ballroom. This was the brilliance that made the entire strategy work. The ballroom occupied the rear of the building, spanning the width of both residences. Both Caroline and John Jacob IV could access it from their respective sides, but Caroline controlled it. The ballroom was hers, her space, her rules, her guest lists. John Jacob IV could use it when she allowed, but everyone understood whose territory this was. And what a ballroom it was. Hunt had designed a space that could accommodate 1,200 guests, 3 times the capacity of Caroline's old brownstone. The room stretched 60 feet wide and 80 feet long with a ceiling height of 25 feet. Enormous by any standard, but Hunt's proportions prevented it from feeling cavernous. The height-to-width ratio created intimacy despite the scale. The floor was polished parquet oak laid in intricate patterns. Massive mirrors covered one wall, doubling the apparent size and reflecting candlelight, later electric light, to create the illusion of endless space filled with endless people. French doors along the park-facing wall could open in warm weather, extending the ballroom onto a terrace. But the ballroom's real genius was its capacity calculation. 1,200 wasn't arbitrary. It was strategic. Caroline's old ballroom held 400, and the 400 had become shorthand for American society's absolute peak. Those 400 families represented everyone who mattered, packed into one room during her annual January ball. It was exclusive precisely because it was constrained. The new ballroom's capacity of 1,200 changed the mathematics entirely. Now Caroline could maintain the 400 as her inner circle while accommodating another 800 guests in concentric rings of decreasing intimacy. The ballroom's geography became a physical manifestation of social hierarchy. The innermost area, closest to where Caroline received guests, remained the exclusive zone, the 400's traditional territory. But now a second tier could be included. Important, but not essential families. Business magnates whose fortunes were too new for full acceptance but too large to ignore. Foreign nobility visiting America. Politicians whose influence was useful even if their pedigree was lacking. And the outer edges of the ballroom, farthest from Caroline, could accommodate a third tier. Aspirants, strivers, families desperate to be seen at Mrs. Astor's ball even if they never spoke to her directly. Their presence at the periphery served multiple purposes. They filled the space, they demonstrated Caroline's expansive power, and they provided the 400 with people to look down upon, reinforcing the inner circle's superiority. The ballroom's design facilitated this hierarchy. Hunt had created subtle variations in ceiling height and detail that made some areas feel more prestigious than others. The section nearest Caroline featured the most elaborate plasterwork, the finest materials. As you moved away from the center, decorative details simplified slightly. Not enough for casual observers to notice, but enough that those attuned to such gradations understood their position. The shared entrance hall connecting the two residences was equally theatrical. Hunt designed a glass-domed space with marble walls and a fountain featuring bronze dolphins and infant Neptunes spouting water. Visitors entering for the first time would pass through bronze gates, cross the forecourt, enter the vestibule lined with Astor ancestor busts, then emerge into this spectacular hall where light filtered through the glass dome, reflecting off marble and water. The effect was overwhelming by design. Before guests even reached Caroline or the ballroom, they'd been subjected to a carefully choreographed sequence of spaces, each one more impressive than the last, each one reinforcing the message, "You are entering the domain of America's most powerful family. Behave accordingly." The dining rooms in each residence further demonstrated the double mansion's strategic brilliance. Caroline's dining room was pure theatrical intimidation. Black marble walls, black and white marble tiled floors covered with polar bear rugs, a massive marble fireplace carved with hunting scenes, tapestries depicting medieval nobles at sport. The room announced that the Astors weren't new money pretending to be aristocracy. They were aristocracy, with the ancestral trappings to prove it. John Jacob IV's spaces were similarly grand but slightly less imposing. His residence functioned as the family's business headquarters, where he met with associates, conducted financial negotiations, hosted dinners related to his various enterprises. His dining room projected power, but prioritized functionality over pure intimidation. This division of purpose made the double mansion more effective than two separate houses would have been. Caroline's side specialized in social warfare, every space designed to intimidate, impress, and maintain her position as society's queen. John Jacob IV's side handled business and political influence. Together, the building projected total dominance across all spheres that mattered in Gilded Age America. The construction had cost a fortune. Estimates ranged from $1 to $2 million, equivalent to perhaps $50 million or more today. But Caroline viewed it as investment, not expense. Every dollar spent on intimidating marble and elaborate plasterwork was a dollar that reinforced her power, prevented challenges, maintained the system that kept her at the top. When the mansion was completed in 1896, the effect on New York society was immediate. Other wealthy families suddenly found their own homes wanting. The Vanderbilt's massive Fifth Avenue palazzo looked gaudy by comparison. The new money families building ornate mansions further up Fifth Avenue looked like they were trying too hard. Caroline's restraint, French Renaissance elegance rather than Italianate excess, made everyone else's architectural choices seem nouveau riche. More importantly, the double mansion announced that the Astor family dynasty was permanent. This wasn't a house that would be sold when one generation died. The structure physically accommodated family continuity, mother and son, today, but implying future generations would occupy these connected residences, perpetuating Astor power indefinitely. Of course, that permanence would prove illusory, but in 1896, standing in the shadow of Hunt's masterpiece, with Caroline presiding over ballroom spectacles that made European courts seem provincial, the Astor dynasty felt eternal. The double mansion had achieved exactly what Caroline intended: architectural dominance so complete that challenging her social authority would require challenging a building that looked like it had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. The ballroom as social sorting machine. The ballroom at 840 Fifth Avenue wasn't just a room where parties happened. It was a precision instrument designed to sort, rank, and control American society with mechanical efficiency. Think of it as a machine. Input: 1,200 guests arriving with varying degrees of social status, wealth, and ambition. Output: a clear hierarchy visible to everyone present, with each person's exact position in society, demonstrated by their physical location, relative to Mrs. Astor. The sorting began before anyone entered the ballroom. Invitations went out in January for the annual ball, typically held in late January or early February. Receiving an invitation meant you existed. Not receiving one meant you didn't, at least not in any way that mattered to the people who controlled business, politics, and culture in Gilded Age America. But the invitation was just entry to the machine. What happened inside the ballroom determined your actual status. Caroline received guests while standing in a specific location, typically near the center of the ballroom, backed by Hunt's most elaborate architectural details. She wore a diamond tiara that caught the light, ensuring she was visually identifiable even in a crowd of 1,200. This wasn't vanity, it was strategic visibility. Everyone needed to know exactly where she stood so they could orient themselves accordingly. The closest circle, perhaps 20 feet radius around Caroline, was reserved for the 400's absolute core. Old money families with impeccable lineage, her closest social allies. People she genuinely liked, which was rare. This inner circle could approach Caroline directly, speak with her, be seen in her immediate presence. That visibility mattered enormously. Business deals were negotiated based on who was seen talking to Mrs. Astor. Marriages were arranged between families who stood together in her circle. The second ring, extending perhaps to 50 feet, included the rest of the 400. Important families, necessary allies, people whose absence would be noticed. They could approach Caroline if she signaled permission. A glance, a slight nod. But they didn't presume. They waited. Their position in this zone announced, "We belong, but we know our place." The third ring, occupying the ballroom's middle distance, held the new money families, foreign visitors, politicians, and others whose inclusion served Caroline's purposes, but who weren't truly accepted. They could see her, could watch the inner circles, but they couldn't approach without invitation. Their presence filled the space, made the ball impressive through sheer numbers. But they were atmosphere, not substance. The outer edges, the areas farthest from Caroline, near the walls and in corners, were for the aspirants. Families who'd received invitations but whose status was marginal. They were present, technically, but their distance from the center announced their irrelevance. Some stayed in these outer zones all night, never approaching Caroline, attending the ball just to say they'd attended. This geographical hierarchy was reinforced by Caroline's movement through the room. When she decided to circulate, which she did strategically, not randomly, She moved from the center outward in concentric rings, speaking briefly with people in each zone before returning to the center. The order of her circulation demonstrated rank. First circle, extended conversations. Second circle, polite exchanges. Third circle, brief acknowledgments. Outer edges. Sometimes nothing more than a distant nod. Ward McAllister, her social secretary, managed the circulation like a military operation. He knew who needed to be acknowledged, who could be ignored, who required just enough attention to keep them loyal, but not enough to suggest they'd risen in status. McAllister would position himself near Caroline, quietly indicating who should approach, who should wait, who should give up and return to the periphery. The ballroom's design supported this system. Hunt had created subtle variations in lighting and decoration that made different zones feel distinct. The center, where Caroline stood, featured the most elaborate ceiling details and the best lighting, during the gaslight era from carefully placed fixtures, later from electric chandeliers positioned to illuminate the inner circle while leaving the outer edges slightly dimmer. The mirrors along one wall served multiple purposes. They made the space seem larger, yes, but they also allowed people throughout the ballroom to watch Caroline's position and movement without obviously staring. You could stand facing away from the center, apparently engaged in conversation, while actually monitoring the mirrors to see who approached Mrs. Astor, how long they spoke, whether they were welcomed or dismissed. The acoustic design was equally clever. The ballroom's proportions allowed conversation in the inner circles to remain private despite the crowd. You could stand 20 feet from Caroline and hear nothing of what she discussed. But if you were in her immediate circle, you could speak quietly and be heard. This acoustic intimacy reinforced the exclusivity. Being close enough to hear Caroline's conversations meant you mattered. The annual ball's timing, late January, was strategic. It came near the end of New York's winter social season, after families had spent months positioning themselves for inclusion. The ball served as the season's verdict. If you'd made it onto the guest list, your year's social efforts had succeeded. If not, you'd failed. The ball's position in the calendar meant families had 11 months to work toward next year's invitation, keeping them focused on pleasing Mrs. Astor year-round. The guest list's creation was theatrical in itself. McAllister would meet with Caroline regularly throughout the previous year, discussing families who'd risen or fallen in her estimation. A business scandal, a divorce, marrying beneath one's station, offending the wrong people at smaller social events, any of these could result in removal from the list. Conversely, a particularly successful business venture, a strategic marriage, demonstrating proper deference at other society events. These could earn an invitation for families previously excluded. The list was never published officially, but everyone knew who'd attended. Newspapers would report the next day, listing prominent guests and describing the event in exhaustive detail. Families who'd attended would mention it casually in conversation for months afterward. Those who hadn't attended would make excuses. They'd been traveling. Someone had been ill. They'd chosen to attend something else that night. Nobody admitted exclusion, but everybody knew. The ballroom also functioned as a marriage market. Wealthy families brought their daughters, hoping to secure advantageous matches with suitable young men from other elite families. Being seen at Mrs. Astor's ball improved a young woman's matrimonial prospects significantly. Not attending suggested problems with her family's status or her personal reputation. Marriages arranged based on connections made at these balls joined fortunes, consolidated business interests, and reinforced the social hierarchy across generations. For men, the ballroom was about business networks as much as social status. Standing in the inner circles meant access to other wealthy men making decisions about investments, partnerships, industrial ventures. A conversation at Mrs. Astor's ball could lead to business opportunities worth millions. Being excluded meant missing those conversations, those opportunities, those networks. The system's genius was that it required constant maintenance. You couldn't attend one ball and assume permanent inclusion. Status had to be reinforced annually through proper behavior, strategic social positioning, and, most importantly, continued deference to Mrs. Astor's authority. The ballroom's geography might change slightly year to year as families rose or fell in Caroline's estimation, but the basic structure remained. Concentric circles radiating from the center, where Mrs. Astor stood in her diamond tiara, sorting America's elite with architectural precision. Beechcliff, the summer headquarters. While Manhattan provided winter theater, Caroline understood that true aristocratic authority required a coastal fortress. Beechcliff commanded 9 oceanfront acres at 580 Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, the summer capital of American high society. The mansion sprawled across 16,400 square feet, with 39 rooms of Italian magnificence gazing across the Atlantic toward the European courts that inspired its grandeur. Built originally in the 1850s as a marine villa, Caroline transformed it into her summer headquarters through Richard Morris Hunt's spectacular renovations between 1888 and 1890. Hunt's waterfront ballroom was pure theatrical excess. Oak parquet floors laid in wave-like patterns rippled beneath guests' feet. Seaweed-shaped brass sconces cast shimmering light across bas-reliefs depicting Poseidon and Aphrodite. The ballroom incorporated 800 panes of glass, mirrored walls, and abundant French doors that transformed evening entertainments into underwater fantasies. This wasn't decorative whimsy. The oceanic theme reinforced a message. The Astors commanded not just Manhattan's social sphere, but nature itself. The ballroom could open completely to the ocean breeze, blurring the boundary between interior and exterior, suggesting that Caroline's domain extended beyond walls to encompass the very Atlantic coast. From 1881 to 1908, Beechcliff served as Newport's social epicenter during the 8-week summer season. Caroline presided over elaborate parties for her elite circle, with the highlight being her summer ball that determined social standing for the following year. Hunt's specially designed ballroom accommodated the full complement of the 400, ensuring that every member of America's social elite could gather under one magnificently decorated roof facing the sea. The summer season operated differently than winter in Manhattan. Newport was about leisure, yachting, tennis, beach activities, but leisure as competitive sport. Who had the finest yacht? Whose parties were most exclusive? Which families could afford to abandon business for 8 weeks of elaborate entertaining? Caroline's presence in Newport legitimized the entire summer colony. Families who couldn't secure invitations to Beechcliff events were effectively excluded from Newport society, regardless of their wealth. After Caroline's death in 1908, the property passed through various owners, eventually becoming a living history museum. In 2010, Oracle founder Larry Ellison purchased Beechcliff for $10.5 million and launched a comprehensive restoration exceeding $100 million. The project, overseen by architect John Grosvenor, aims to return Beechcliff to its 1881 appearance, creating the Beechcliff Art Museum to house Ellison's collection of 18th and 19th century European art. The restoration includes rebuilding the dramatic arched loggia, destroyed by Hurricane Carol in 1954, and restoring Hunt's original features lost to time and weather. That a tech billionaire would invest over $100 million restoring Caroline Astor's summer palace proves that Gilded Age glamour retains its power to captivate, even when the social system it supported has long since collapsed. Ferncliff, the feudal kingdom. Beyond the glittering ballrooms lay Ferncliff, 2,800 acres in the Hudson River Valley that revealed the Astors' most ambitious vision. Creating American aristocracy required not just social dominance but actual feudal landholding. The estate sprawled across Rhinebeck's rolling hills like a self-contained principality. A substantial mansion built in 1874, dairy and poultry operations, horse breeding stables, multiple staff quarters, a private railroad siding. This wasn't a retreat. It was territorial control on European scale. Here's what's remarkable. Caroline rarely visited. She preferred European spas to pastoral American landscapes. Ferncliff was William's passion, and later John Jacob Astor IV's domain. But Caroline understood its strategic value even without personal attachment. Gilded Age aristocracy required demonstrating that your wealth came from land, not just industry. Old European nobility owned estates. Therefore, American families aspiring to aristocratic status needed estates too. The original mansion was greatly expanded when John Jacob IV inherited the property in 1892. In 1902, he commissioned Stanford White to design a remarkable sports pavilion, 40,000 square feet, including one of America's first indoor swimming pools, tennis court, squash court, and bowling alley. The building, inspired by Versailles' Grand Trianon, featured arched windows and marble columns, bringing French classical architecture to the Hudson Valley with characteristic Astor audacity. The estate included a gatehouse designed by Louis Ayres in 1879, various staff quarters, dairy barns, a tea house, and a greenhouse imported from England. Impressive iron gates from 1895 marked the main entrance like medieval fortifications protecting modern nobility. What Ferncliff represented was legitimacy through land. The Astors could be dismissed as mere merchants, fur traders, real estate speculators, commercial operators. But a 2,800-acre working estate with agricultural operations and architectural splendor, that suggested permanence, rootedness, the kind of dynastic continuity that European aristocracy had and American new money desperately wanted. Caroline never needed to visit for Ferncliff to serve her purposes. Its existence in the family portfolio announced, "We're not just rich. We own the land itself. We're not temporary. We're established." After John Jacob IV's death on the Titanic in 1912, the estate passed to his son William Vincent Astor, who eventually demolished the original mansion in the 1940s and converted Stanford White's sports pavilion into his primary residence, Astor Courts. Following Vincent's death in 1959, Brooke Astor broke up the massive estate, donating 200 acres to establish Ferncliff Forest Nature Preserve in 1964, with other portions becoming private homes and a nursing facility. Eric and Wendy Schmidt purchased Astor Courts in 2016, undertaking extensive restoration with PBDW architects, and Samuel White, Stanford White's great-grandson. The estate's fragmentation after 1959 reflected changing American attitudes toward landed wealth, but its century of Astor ownership had accomplished its purpose, proving the family's aristocratic credentials through territorial control. The architecture of intimidation. Caroline Astor's genius wasn't just building grand houses, it was understanding how physical spaces could psychologically manipulate everyone who entered them. Every detail of her mansions was calculated to create specific emotional responses. Let's examine the techniques she and her architects employed to maintain control through environmental psychology. In each residence, Caroline received guests while standing before her life-size portrait by Carolus Duran. This wasn't vanity, it was multiplication of presence. Guests faced two Caroline Astors, the painted version in elaborate gown and jewels, and the living version similarly adorned. The portrait suggested permanence. She'd been painted, memorialized, made eternal, while the living woman demonstrated current power. The doubling was deeply unsettling on a subconscious level. Hunt designed the Fifth Avenue mansion so guests experienced escalating luxury. The entrance vestibule was impressive, marble, busts of ancestors. But the Great Hall beyond was more impressive. Soaring 3 stories, elaborate plasterwork. The drawing rooms were even more ornate. Finally, the ballroom represented peak magnificence. This progression ensured that by the time guests reached Caroline, they'd been subjected to continuous architectural intimidation, arriving already psychologically diminished. Caroline's preference for marble, especially black marble in the dining room, wasn't about aesthetics alone. Marble is heavy, cold, permanent. It suggests buildings that will outlast everyone present. The black marble dining room with its polar bear rugs created an atmosphere of ancestral hunting lodges, implying the Astors had been wealthy for centuries, generations. They hadn't, and would remain wealthy for generations more. The ballroom's acoustic properties allowed Caroline to conduct quiet conversations that couldn't be overheard even in crowded rooms. This created the impression that she possessed secret knowledge, that important discussions happened in her presence that others weren't privy to. The acoustic design gave her informational advantage. She could hear what others said across the room, while her own conversations remained private. Caroline's diamond tiara wasn't fashion, it was a beacon. In a ballroom of 1,200 people, guests needed to know exactly where she stood. The tiara caught light from any angle, making her position constantly visible. This allowed her to control the room's geography without moving. People oriented themselves relative to her location, and she could observe who approached, who kept distance, who tried to position themselves advantageously. Caroline renovated constantly, not because the houses needed it, but to prevent anyone from matching her. By the time a rival family built something comparable to her current decor, she'd already moved to the next trend. The French Regency dining room at 355th Avenue was transformed into glittering Louis XVI style. The drawing room underwent multiple renovations. This constant change kept everyone else perpetually behind, unable to achieve the same level of current sophistication. Caroline maintained staffs of 50-plus servants at each major residence. These weren't just for convenience, they were demonstrations of power. The seamless perfection of her entertaining came from enormous hidden labor. Guests who couldn't afford similar staffing would attempt to recreate her events and fail, revealing their comparative poverty. The invisible army made Caroline's hospitality seem effortless, which made others' visible efforts seem inadequate. Her residences carefully segregated spaces where guests were received from spaces where family lived. Guests never saw private quarters, never witnessed the messiness of actual daily life. They experienced only the theatrical version of Astor existence, perfectly staged, perfectly executed. This separation allowed Caroline to maintain mystique. No one knew how she actually lived, which meant they couldn't know if their own private lives were comparable or inferior. Caroline kept her public rooms slightly cool, not uncomfortable, but just enough to prevent guests from fully relaxing. Relaxed people become familiar, presumptuous. Slightly cool people remain alert, formal, conscious of their environment. Meanwhile, Caroline, accustomed to her houses and dressed appropriately, remained comfortable while her guests experienced subtle physical discomfort that translated to psychological unease. Each residence had distinctive scents. Fresh flowers changed daily, specific perfumes, particular woods burning in fireplaces. These olfactory signatures created memory associations. Years after attending an event at Mrs. Astor's, catching a similar scent would trigger memories of the experience, the anxiety of being judged, the relief of inclusion. Scent is the sense most powerfully connected to memory, and Caroline's houses were engineered to be unforgettable. Caroline allowed selective photography and press coverage of her events, but always controlled what was documented. The threat of being photographed, or deliberately not photographed, kept guests performing proper behavior. Everyone knew the newspapers would report who'd attended, what they'd worn, how they'd been received. This public documentation meant that social failures at Caroline's events became part of permanent record, while social successes could be referenced for years. These techniques worked because they operated below conscious awareness. Guests didn't think, "I'm being psychologically manipulated by acoustic design and material choices." They simply felt the effect. Awe, anxiety, gratitude for inclusion, determination to maintain access. The architecture did Caroline's work for her, maintaining control while she appeared to simply be a gracious hostess in beautiful homes. When the empire crumbled. October 30th, 1908. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor died at 845th Avenue, age 78. The woman who'd ruled American society for half a century was gone, and her empire began collapsing immediately. The funeral was appropriately grand. Services at Grace Church, burial at Trinity Cemetery. Obituaries in every major newspaper documenting her reign as America's social queen. But beneath the respectful coverage, a question circulated through society. What happens now? John Jacob Astor IV inherited his mother's mansion. He owned the building, the furnishings, the physical spaces where Caroline had wielded power. What he didn't inherit was her authority. That died with her. John Jacob IV tried. He hosted parties at 840 Fifth Avenue, attempting to continue his mother's traditions. But something fundamental was missing. The guests came. How could they refuse an Astor invitation? But the gatherings felt hollow. Without Caroline standing before her portrait, receiving guests with that particular combination of graciousness and intimidation, the mansion was just an expensive venue. The ballroom that had sorted American society with mechanical precision became just a room. Large, certainly. Beautiful, absolutely. But no longer imbued with the power to determine social standing through geographical proximity to the hostess. John Jacob IV lacked his mother's gift for making architectural space perform social work. Part of the problem was gender. Gilded Age society granted women authority over social matters that men simply didn't possess. A man hosting parties was doing business networking or entertaining for political purposes. A woman hosting parties was performing the serious work of society maintenance. John Jacob IV could never occupy his mother's role because that role was inherently feminine in late 19th, early 20th century America. But the larger problem was that the system Caroline had built required her specific personality, her strategic intelligence, her ruthlessness disguised as graciousness, her decades of accumulated social knowledge about which families had risen or fallen and why. This wasn't transferable authority, it was personal power that happened to operate through architectural spaces. By 1910, New York society was fragmenting. Without Caroline's centralizing authority, multiple competing social leaders emerged. The Vanderbilts had always been powerful, but now they weren't competing with Mrs. Astor. They were competing with each other and various other wealthy families for social supremacy. The clear hierarchy that Caroline had maintained dissolved into confusion. Then, April 15th, 1912. The Titanic sank, taking John Jacob Astor IV with it. He'd been traveling with his second wife, Madeline, a woman 30 years his junior, controversial precisely because the age gap violated social propriety. John Jacob IV had forced society to accept the marriage through sheer wealth and Astor name recognition. But he'd spent social capital doing so, capital his mother would never have wasted on personal desires. When he died at sea, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The Titanic represented Gilded Age excess at its peak, the largest, most luxurious ship ever built, supposedly unsinkable, destroyed on its maiden voyage by an iceberg. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in America, inheritor of his mother's social empire, unable to save himself, despite unlimited money. The metaphor was perfect. Wealth couldn't protect against fate. Power had limits. The Gilded Age's assumptions that money solved everything, that the established order would persist indefinitely, that certain families would always rule, were proven false in the North Atlantic's freezing water. After John Jacob IV's death, 840 Fifth Avenue lost whatever remaining social significance it possessed. His widow Madeline had no interest in continuing society traditions. His son Vincent inherited the property, but lived primarily at other Astor residences. The double mansion, designed to house generations of family dynasty, housed no one in particular. The neighborhood was changing anyway. Fifth Avenue above 59th Street was becoming increasingly commercial. The residential palaces of the 1890s were impractical, expensive to maintain, surrounded by businesses and hotels that destroyed the exclusive atmosphere. One by one, Gilded Age families were abandoning their mansions or converting them to other uses. In 1925, Vincent Astor sold 840 to 842 Fifth Avenue to a real estate developer. The double mansion, Caroline's Palace, Hunt's masterpiece, the building designed to project Astor permanence for centuries, was demolished in 1926, 20 years after Caroline's death, 18 years after its completion. The site became Temple Emmanuel, a Reform Jewish synagogue. The symbolism was striking. The building designed to house Christian American aristocracy replaced by a temple serving Jewish immigrants and their descendants. Exactly the kind of new Americans that Caroline's 400 had been designed to exclude. Today, standing on Fifth Avenue and 65th Street, You can look at Temple Emmanuel and imagine the ballroom that once occupied approximately the same space. Imagine Caroline standing in her diamond tiara, sorting American society with architectural precision. Imagine the anxious guests calculating their distance from her, hoping for acknowledgement, fearing dismissal. But it's difficult to imagine, because that world is so thoroughly gone that even its physical spaces have been erased. Beechcliff survived, barely. After decades of changing ownership and near demolition, Larry Ellison's restoration in 2010 saved the structure. But it survives as a museum, not as the summer headquarters of American society. The ballroom with its ocean theme now hosts art exhibitions rather than the 400. Ferncliff was broken up. 2,800 acres divided among various purposes, the original mansion demolished. Only Stanford White's sports pavilion survived as Astor Courts, now owned by tech billionaires rather than industrial-age aristocrats. The physical spaces where Caroline Astor ruled American society for 50 years were either destroyed or repurposed within decades of her death. The Empire State Building rose where her brownstone stood. A synagogue replaced her greatest palace. Her summer estate became a museum. Her feudal kingdom fragmented into nature preserves and nursing homes. Everything she built, architecturally, socially, dynastically, proved temporary. Not because the buildings were poorly constructed. Hunt designed them to last centuries. But because the social system they supported couldn't outlast the woman who'd created it. Caroline's death revealed the truth. Her power hadn't been architectural. The mansions were just tools. Her power was personal. Intelligence, strategy, ruthlessness, decades of accumulated knowledge about society's mechanics. When she died, that knowledge died. The buildings remained briefly, emptied of meaning, until economics and changing times erased them too. The legacy. How one woman invented American society. Caroline Astor died in 1908. Her mansions were demolished by 1931. The social system she created collapsed within years of her death. Yet we're still talking about her. Still fascinated by the 400, still studying her strategies. Why? Because Caroline Astor invented something that persists even after its physical manifestations vanished. She created the template for American social hierarchy in a nation that officially rejected hierarchy. America was founded on the rejection of inherited titles and aristocratic privilege. No nobility, no hereditary power. Everyone theoretically equal under law. But Caroline understood that humans crave hierarchy, that societies naturally stratify, that people desperately want to know who's above them and who's below them. She gave Americans aristocracy without calling it aristocracy. She created exclusivity without inherited titles. She built a system where you could rise through proper behavior and advantageous marriage, theoretically, but where in practice she controlled access absolutely. The genius was making it seem natural. Of course, only 400 people could fit in the ballroom. That was architectural constraint, not arbitrary exclusion. Of course, you needed 3 generations of respectable lineage. That was tradition, not discrimination. Of course, certain families belonged and others didn't. That was simply the way things were. Caroline took the messy, chaotic social reality of Gilded Age New York, new fortunes appearing weekly, old families losing wealth, immigrants arriving, traditional hierarchies collapsing, and imposed order through sheer force of will backed by strategic architecture. She made chaos legible. And once it was legible, she could control it. The 400 became shorthand for American social exclusivity that persists 140 years later. We still refer to the 400 when discussing elite groups. The number itself, arbitrary, based on one ballroom's capacity, became permanently embedded in how Americans think about social hierarchy. Her model influenced everything that came after. Country clubs with limited membership, that's Caroline's scarcity principle in action. Charity galas with tiered ticket prices placing people in different rooms or sections, that's her concentric circle geography replicated. The Met Gala, where who you sit with indicates your exact position in fashion/entertainment hierarchy, that's pure Mrs. Astor methodology applied to modern celebrity culture. Harvard's final clubs. Manhattan co-op boards that reject billionaires for insufficient social standing, private school admission processes that consider family legacy more than academic merit. All of these are descendants of Caroline's system, gatekeepers determining access, scarcity creating value, social geography indicating rank. But her deeper legacy is demonstrating that in America, money alone isn't power. Money plus real estate plus social theater equals control. Caroline understood something most Gilded Age millionaires didn't. You can't buy your way into the established elite. You have to build parallel systems that make the established elite irrelevant, or force them to acknowledge your alternative power base. That's why she built mansions instead of just attending other people's parties. Why she created her own social spaces instead of trying to infiltrate existing ones. She didn't ask for acceptance. She made herself the gatekeeper whose acceptance others sought. The modern parallels are striking. Tech billionaires building private compounds and hosting exclusive conferences at their estates. They're following Caroline's playbook. Celebrities who create their own award shows and charity events instead of attending traditional ones, same strategy. Anyone who builds private spaces and then controls access to them is using techniques Caroline perfected 130 years ago. What happened to her properties proves that even the grandest architectural statements are temporary. The Empire State Building stands where her brownstone stood, and probably fewer than 1 in 10,000 people who visit the Empire State Building knows an Astor mansion was there first. Temple Emmanuel replaced her greatest palace, and congregants praying there likely don't imagine Caroline sorting society in approximately the same physical space generations earlier. This impermanence might seem like failure. Caroline built an empire, and it crumbled within decades. But perhaps that's not the right way to measure her success. Because what she actually created, the concepts, the strategies, the understanding of how social power works, those survived even when the buildings didn't. Every time someone uses architecture to project power, they're following Caroline's lead. Every time scarcity is deliberately created to increase value, that's her technique. Every time someone builds their own space rather than trying to enter existing spaces, that's her strategy. She proved that in America, where official aristocracy is forbidden, you can create unofficial aristocracy through social theater performed in carefully designed architectural spaces. You can sort people into hierarchies they'll accept as natural because they're based on physical geography rather than explicit rules. You can control who matters by controlling who gets invited to the spaces where people who matter gather, the mansions are gone, the social system collapsed, the Astor dynasty fragmented, but the model remains. Because Caroline Astor understood something fundamental about human nature, we need to know where we stand. Give people a clear hierarchy, and they'll generally accept their place in it, especially if you make that hierarchy visible through physical space, through who stands where, through architectural intimidation dressed as hospitality. She weaponized real estate, and that weapon remains available to anyone who understands how she wielded it. That's her legacy. Not the demolished mansions, but the knowledge that architecture plus strategy equals power. That geography determines hierarchy. That controlling physical space means controlling the people who occupy it. 1 woman. 4 primary mansions. 50 years of absolute social control. The buildings are gone, but what she proved, that you can dominate American society through architectural strategy, that knowledge survives. That's why we're still studying her. That's why her story matters. Because anyone who wants to understand power, how it's built, how it's maintained, how it eventually crumbles, can learn from Caroline Astor. The woman who ruled the Gilded Age from ballrooms, carefully designed to sort America's elite with mechanical precision. The woman who understood that in America, whoever controls the party controls everything.